Hello guys, welcome to Arcane Paradox. Today we have an incredible story for you. Pomfrey's post-troll scan revealed 68 malnutrition charms on Harry, and Wizengamot arrested Dumbledore. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, The Scan. The troll was dead. It lay across the floor of the girls' bathroom on the third floor like a fallen chimney stack, its club hand still curled loosely around nothing, the stone tiles cracked beneath its bulk. The smell was extraordinary, a wet, animal thickness that coated the back of the throat and stayed there. Water still dripped from the broken pipe it had smashed on its way in, pattering against the back of its grey, lumpen head in a rhythm that was almost peaceful now that the screaming had stopped. Hermione sat on the floor near the sinks, her robes soaked, her hair plastered flat to the sides of her face. She wasn't crying. She looked like she'd gone somewhere very far away inside herself and hadn't quite come back yet. Ron stood a few feet away with his wand still out and his mouth still open, staring at the troll the way you stare at a firework that's already gone off, like part of his brain hadn't yet received the message that the danger was over. Harry was the first one to move. He pulled his wand out of the troll's nostril, where he had apparently shoved it during the chaos of the last 4 minutes, wiped it on his robes, and looked at Hermione. "Are you hurt?" She looked up at him. There was a long scratch on her left hand from where she'd scrambled across the floor, and her bottom lip was trembling very slightly, though her jaw was set hard against it. "I don't think so," she said. "I don't, no. I'm not hurt." "Ron." "I'm brilliant," Ron said, in the voice of someone who was absolutely not brilliant and would likely need to sit down very soon. Then the door burst open and 4 professors flooded in, Quirrell first, pressing himself against the wall, then Snape with his black robes sweeping behind him, then McGonagall with her square spectacles and her expression like a woman who has just witnessed something that has fundamentally altered her view of the universe, and finally Dumbledore, who stood at the back with his hands folded and his eyes moving carefully across the room, cataloguing everything with those pale, precise eyes of his. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then McGonagall's voice, very carefully controlled, "Explain." They explained. Or rather, Ron explained in a tumbling rush about the troll and the corridor, and Harry explained about the wand, and Hermione sat very still and didn't say much, which was, Harry thought distantly, very unlike her. And then she did say something, and what she said was so unexpected that Ron actually turned to stare at her. "I went looking for it," Hermione said. Her voice was steady. "I thought I could handle it. I'd read about them. I was wrong, and Harry and Ron came to find me." She looked at McGonagall without flinching. "It's my fault. Please don't take points from Gryffindor." McGonagall looked at her for a very long moment, and something shifted behind her eyes, something that wasn't just surprise. It was, Harry thought, something closer to recognition. "5 points to each of you," McGonagall said at last. "For sheer dumb luck." But she didn't sound angry anymore. Dumbledore looked at all 3 of them in turn, and when his gaze landed on Harry it stayed there a beat longer than it needed to, and then he smiled, warm, grandfatherly, the smile of a man who finds the world endlessly, gently amusing, and said, "Off to bed, I think. All of you. Madame Pomfrey will want to have a look." "They seem uninjured, Albus," Snape said, with the tone of someone who found the entire situation distasteful and would have preferred not to be here. "All the same," Dumbledore said pleasantly. "Best to be sure." Madame Poppy Pomfrey had been the matron of Hogwarts for 23 years. In that time she had treated dragon pox, bludger injuries, potion accidents, one memorable case of a second year who had transfigured his own nose into a teapot spout, and a full range of cuts, bruises, broken bones, and general catastrophes that 1,200 years of children in a castle full of magic tended to produce. She had a system. She ran a clean ward, a quiet ward, and she did not panic. She was not panicking now. But her hand had gone very still. The diagnostic wand, an 8-inch instrument of pale hawthorn, specifically calibrated for medical scanning, different from a combat wand in the way a scalpel is different from a broadsword, was hovering 6 inches above Harry Potter's chest and glowing a color that it had absolutely no business glowing. It was supposed to glow white for a clean scan. It was glowing amber. Not a mild amber, the kind that indicated minor deficiencies or a lingering cold. A deep, saturated amber, the color of old honey, of warning lights, of something that had been burning for a very long time. Harry was sitting on the bed in the middle of the ward, still in his damp robes, looking at her with those green eyes that always reminded her of something she couldn't quite name, and he said, "Is something wrong?" "Hold still," Pomfrey said. She passed the wand again. Amber. She cast a secondary charm, the kind reserved for curse damage, for deep magical interference, for situations that went beyond ordinary illness. Her lips moved silently. The diagnostic light shifted, spread, deepened, and then the wand's tip produced a series of floating glyphs, medical runes that hung in the air above Harry's chest like a quiet accusation. She read them. She read them again. The number at the center of the display, in crisp, unambiguous magical notation, read, 68. For a moment the ward was absolutely silent except for the dripping of Ron's damp sleeve onto the stone floor and the distant sound of the castle settling around them. Hermione had wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and was watching Pomfrey with the sharp, watchful attention of a girl who understood that something was happening and was determined to understand what. Pomfrey cancelled the diagnostic display with a sharp flick of her wrist. Then she turned to the three of them with an expression that was very, very professionally controlled. "Miss Granger, Mr. Weasley. You'll wait outside, please." Ron opened his mouth. "Outside," Pomfrey said, in the voice that had ended arguments with seventh years for 2 decades. They went outside. Pomfrey drew the curtain around Harry's bed, cast a silencing charm, and cast the full diagnostic sequence again from scratch, the long one, the comprehensive one, the one she only used for serious curse damage or suspected long-term magical abuse. It took 4 minutes and left her with a set of runes floating in the air that she stood and read with her arms folded and her expression very still. 68 malnutrition charms. Layered. Nested. Some of them so old and deeply set that they had calcified into his magical core like scar tissue, fused with his developmental signatures so thoroughly that a casual scan would have missed them entirely, would have just read them as natural variation, as baseline, as this is simply how Harry Potter is. Which was, she understood with a cold clarity that moved through her chest like floodwater, entirely the point. She ran a secondary analysis to determine the nature of each charm. Malnutrition charms were not, in isolation, illegal. Healers occasionally used attenuated versions of them in cases of severe overconsumption or metabolic magic disorders, the kind where a patient's core was producing so much excess magical output that it was burning through their physical reserves. Used carefully, with full consent, monitored rigorously, they were a legitimate tool. But 68 of them, layered on an infant, because the oldest ones dated back to when he was 18 months old, she could see it in the calcification patterns, in the way they'd grown into him like rings into a tree, and none of them placed by any healer who'd filed paperwork with St. Mungo's, and all of them oriented not toward metabolic management but toward suppression. Growth suppression. Nutritional suppression. And, most damningly, magical output suppression. Several of the middle layer charms were specifically calibrated to reduce his magical core's ambient power signature. Someone had deliberately, systematically, and over the course of years, made Harry Potter smaller. In every sense. She sat down on the edge of the bed across from him. He was watching her with that particular patience of his, the kind that didn't look like patience because it wasn't. It was the practiced stillness of a child who had learned very young that asking questions too eagerly got you nothing. "Harry," she said. "Have you always been small for your age?" He blinked. Yeah. My cousin's a lot bigger than me." "Everyone always," he stopped. Looked at her more carefully. "Why? Have you always had trouble concentrating in certain lessons? Felt tired in ways you couldn't explain? Ever had the feeling that your magic was just, out of reach, like you were trying to do something through thick glass. His expression changed. Something moved through his eyes that was complicated and young and very, very old at the same time. How did you know that? Pomfrey folded her hands in her lap. She had been a healer for 23 years. She had delivered terrible news to students' parents after Quidditch accidents. She had sat with a 15-year-old girl who had accidentally burned her own core out attempting a spell 5 years beyond her level. She knew how to have hard conversations. This was different. Someone, she said, carefully, has placed a number of charms on you. Medical charms, or things that were dressed up to look like medical charms. They've been affecting your body, your growth, your health, your appetite. And your magic. She paused. 68 of them. The oldest ones have been on you since you were very young. Harry stared at her. The silencing charm held the silence in. Outside, she could vaguely feel the shape of the world continuing, the castle breathing, the enchanted ceiling of the great hall probably showing the storm that was still rolling over the highlands, students in beds in the dormitory above, Ron and Hermione presumably sitting just outside the ward door arguing quietly about whether to knock. All of it normal. All of it completely unaware. Since I was young, Harry said slowly. How young? The earliest traces suggest 18 months. Something happened in his face that she couldn't fully read, not anger, not yet. It was more like watching someone try to do arithmetic on a number too large to hold comfortably in the mind. He was calculating. She watched him calculate. Watched him reach the answer, and then watched him decide not to say it out loud, and that quiet, self-contained decision told her more about the life he'd lived than she wanted to know. Who put them there? He asked. I don't know yet, she said, which was technically true. She had suspicions. The charms were layered with extraordinary skill, not the work of an amateur, not the work of someone who'd been taught healing in a night class somewhere. This was masterwork. This was someone who understood the intersection of medical charms and core-binding magic at a level that very few witches and wizards in Britain could claim. She could probably count on one hand the people alive with both the knowledge and the opportunity. She chose not to count them out loud. Am I going to be all right? Harry asked. And there it was. Not who did this to me or why or what does this mean, just the practical, immediate, matter-of-fact question of whether he was going to be all right. She had worked in this ward for long enough to know that children who'd had genuinely loving, secure childhoods didn't ask that question first. Yes, she said firmly. The charms can be removed. It will take time and several specialist healers from St. Mungo's, but yes. You will be completely all right. She held his gaze. Better than all right, actually. He nodded, once, and then looked down at his hands. Pomfrey uncrossed her ankles and stood up. I'm going to keep you here overnight. I'm going to begin the process of filing the relevant paperwork. She let that sentence sit for a moment, let him understand what relevant paperwork meant, that this was going to leave this room, that it was going to become a thing that existed in the world beyond his current experience of it. You should sleep. I won't sleep, he said. No, she agreed. But you should try. She stepped outside the curtain and closed it behind her, and then she stood in the quiet of the main ward for exactly 12 seconds with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and her breathing controlled and deliberate, and then she walked to her office, closed the door, and began to cast the most important set of charms she had ever cast, a full evidential preservation array, locking the diagnostic results in an unalterable magical record that could not be edited, could not be removed, could not be lost. She worked quickly and precisely and without a single wasted motion, and when it was done she sat at her desk and looked at the sealed record hovering above her hands. In the morning she would send an owl to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She would not send it to the headmaster. Hermione came back in at 11:30, when Pomfrey had returned to the ward and was making an excellent pretense of checking the other students who were there overnight, 2 Hufflepuff boys with minor hex burns from a disagreement over a gobstones match. Ron had gone to bed after 45 minutes of hovering outside the door, because Ron was honest about the limits of his staying power in the way that Hermione simply was not. She pulled the curtain aside just enough to see Harry, who was lying on his back staring at the ceiling with his glasses still on his face. "You didn't sleep," she said, climbing onto the edge of the bed and sitting cross-legged at the foot of it. "I said I wouldn't. Pomfrey told us to go. You came back." Ron went to bed. She tucked her blanket around her knees. What did she find? He turned his head to look at her. Outside the high windows, the storm had broken and there was thin moonlight coming through in pale strips across the ward floor. 68 charms, he said. Medical ones. The kind that suppress things. Stop things from working properly. Hermione was very quiet for a moment. When she was processing something that required the full force of her mind, she went very still in a particular way, not blank, but dense. Like a computer working through a large file. Suppress what things? Growth. Nutrition. Magic. She breathed in slowly through her nose. How long have they been there? Since I was 18 months old. The moonlight shifted as a cloud moved. Hermione looked at him with an expression that he couldn't recall seeing on her face before, something beyond surprise, beyond shock, something that was arriving from a direction she'd never been hit from before. She was, Harry understood, not just concerned for him. She was recalibrating. Some fundamental assumption about the world she'd walked into 4 months ago was being quietly, precisely dismantled. "Someone did that deliberately," she said. "Not a question." "Yes. To keep you, what? Small? Weaker? All of it." He paused. "Pomfrey's filing something with the DMLE." Hermione nodded very slowly. "Good," she said, and the word came out with a firmness that surprised them both a little. She wasn't sure what she'd expected to feel, or maybe she'd expected to feel something muddier, more conflicted, more weight, let's gather more information before reaching conclusions. But her first instinct was not to pump the brakes. It was good. "That's good, Harry." "Yeah." He looked back at the ceiling. "I keep thinking about flying," he said, which seemed like a non sequitur but wasn't, because she waited and he continued, "I got on a broomstick for the first time and I was just good at it. Right away. And everyone said that was incredible, like I was born with it." He paused. "But what if I wasn't just good at flying? What if I was supposed to be brilliant at everything and someone just turned most of it off?" Hermione didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that wouldn't sound either dismissive or grandiose, and she was smart enough to know that neither would help him right now. What she did say, eventually, was, "Whatever it is you actually are, not the suppressed version, the actual version, you should know that I'm here for that too." He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "Not just the comfortable, manageable, easily categorized version of you that everyone seems to have decided on. The real one." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, even if it's a lot. Especially if it's a lot." She adjusted her blanket. "I like a lot." Something in his face shifted, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, the thing underneath that had to exist before a smile could happen. He turned back to the ceiling. "Get some sleep, Hermione. You first. That's not how this works." "I know," she said. "I'm staying anyway." Madame Pomfrey's owl left Hogwarts at 5:37 in the morning. It was a large, serious-looking tawny named Caduceus. She had named him herself, when she'd acquired him for exactly this kind of professional correspondence, the kind that needed to arrive quickly and be signed for. He accepted the sealed, worded letter without fuss, tucked it against his chest, and launched himself from the Ollery window into the pale grey Scottish dawn with a purposefulness that matched his owner's mood entirely. The letter was addressed to Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and it was marked with 3 seals: Pomfrey's professional healer seal in red wax, the Hogwarts Medical Ward's institutional seal in gold, and, most significantly, An evidential integrity charm that would tell the recipient that the contents have been neither altered nor read by any party other than the original sender since being sealed. Inside the letter was a summary of the diagnostic findings, a copy of the evidential preservation record, and a single carefully worded sentence at the end that read, "I am reporting this in accordance with Section 14 of the Magical Child Protection Act 1976, which requires immediate mandatory reporting of any evidence of sustained magical harm to a minor. I have not yet informed Hogwarts administration, as the magical signatures of several charms require independent analysis to determine origin, and I believe the integrity of the evidence is best served by a direct report to your office rather than one routed through institutional channels." She'd rewritten that last clause 4 times. The version she sent was the most diplomatic. The version she'd written first had said something rather more direct about why she wasn't going through Dumbledore. She stood at the Ollery window until Caduceus was a speck against the clouds, and then she went back to her ward. Harry was asleep. He'd made it, eventually. She'd checked on him at 2 in the morning and he'd been awake, and then at 4:30 he'd been deeply, utterly out, with Hermione Granger asleep at the foot of his bed wrapped in a blanket, her bushy hair fanned around her head like something botanical. Pomfrey had considered waking Miss Granger and sending her back to her dormitory, and then had decided that some rules could wait until tomorrow. She ran a third diagnostic scan on Harry while he slept. She wanted a third data set, a third independent reading, everything documented in triplicate because she understood now, had understood since approximately 2 in the morning, since she'd sat at her desk rereading the rune patterns while the castle was quiet, that what she had found was going to be contested. Things like this always were. The scan came back the same. 68 charms. Origin signatures partially obscured by deliberate layering, but 3 of the deepest, oldest ones, the ones placed at 18 months, before the obscuring layers had been added, had signatures that were clear enough to read. She looked at those signatures for a long time. Then she closed her eyes, opened them again, and very carefully added that information to the evidential record. A second owl was leaving her office window before 6. This one was addressed to the Wizengamot's clerk of records, and it was requesting a copy of the legal guardianship documentation for one Harry James Potter, including the original orders placing him with his Muggle relations after the death of his parents. She already knew who had signed those orders. But she needed the paperwork to prove it. Dumbledore came to the hospital wing at 7:15, which was earlier than she'd expected, and suggested that someone, almost certainly Severus Snape, who had a preternatural sensitivity to the currents of the castle's life that Pomfrey had always found slightly unsettling, had told him something was different this morning. He came alone, which was either polite or strategic, and he knocked on her office door before entering, which was courtesy she appreciated and didn't trust. He was wearing deep blue robes and had his silver hair loose over his shoulders, and he looked, as he always looked, like the kind of person who makes you instinctively want to believe that everything is under control and the adults have the situation in hand. It was an effect so consistent that she had sometimes wondered how much of it was deliberate. Today she was more than sometimes wondering. "Poppy," he said, with that warm, unhurried manner. "I understand there was a rather dramatic evening." "There was," she said. She gestured to the chair across from her desk and didn't stand up. "Sit down, Albus." Something almost imperceptible moved in his expression, just the tiniest recalibration, because she had not called him headmaster as she usually did in professional contexts, and he noticed everything. He sat down. "I performed a full diagnostic on Harry Potter last night," she said. "Following the troll incident." "Quite right," he said. "Standard protocol. I found 68 malnutrition charms." The pause was about 3 seconds long, which was 2 seconds longer than it should have been if the information were genuinely surprising. "Good Lord," he said. "The oldest date back to when he was 18 months old." She folded her hands on her desk. "I've filed a report with the DMLE under Section 14. Another pause, shorter this time, and then something moved through those blue eyes, not quite alarm, but the particular quality of attention that someone with a very complicated plan gives to an unexpected variable. "That's a significant step," he said. "Wouldn't it have been better to—" "No," she said. He looked at her. With respect, headmaster, she said, and the headmaster was deliberate now, was armor not courtesy, a mandatory reporting provision is called mandatory for a reason. I don't have a choice in the matter. Nor would I exercise one if I did. She kept her eyes on his. This is a child in my care who has been systematically harmed. That is the beginning and end of my professional obligation. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was still measured, still warm, but there was something underneath it now, a kind of weariness, or the texture of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just felt the first sign that the weight is about to shift. He is safe, he said. He has always been safe. There are things I know about Harry's situation, about what is required, what is necessary, that are not, you can explain them to Madame Bones, Pomfrey said. The silence this time was long and very full. Poppy, I've documented everything, she said. The full diagnostic record, the evidential preservation, the origin signatures. She held his gaze. All of it. And it is already on its way to the DMLE in a sealed, integrity-charmed record. She paused. I'm telling you this out of professional courtesy. Not because there is anything you can do about it. Dumbledore looked at her for a very long time. And she looked back, because she had been looking after the children of this school for 23 years and she was not afraid of the look, was not softened by the warmth he could turn on like a lamp, was not moved by the weight of the history this man carried or the scale of the things he'd done. Because none of that, not the war, not the defeat of Grindelwald, not the trust of the wizarding world, not one single piece of it was relevant to what she had found on that scan. I hope, Dumbledore said finally, that when the full context is understood, so do I, she said. And I hope that context is everything you believe it to be. She stood up, which was a signal she did not make subtle. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a ward to run. He stood. He looked older, suddenly, than she'd ever seen him, not frail, nothing so simple as frail, but burdened in a way that usually didn't show. He moved to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. He is extraordinary, Dumbledore said quietly. Whatever else you believe of me, I have always known that. Then you should have let him be, Pomfrey said. He left without responding. She waited until the sound of his footsteps faded, and then she went into the ward and checked on Harry Potter, who was still asleep in the thin grey morning light, one arm over his face, breathing slowly and steadily, and looking for all the world like any ordinary 11-year-old boy after an extraordinary night. She knew, now, that he was not. She had the documentation to prove it. And she had sent it to the only person in Britain whose job it was to care. The morning was just beginning, and somewhere over the highlands, a serious-looking tawny owl was flying very fast through the breaking dawn, carrying a letter that was going to change everything. Chapter 2, The Weight of Knowing. Harry woke up and the first thing he did was flex his fingers. He didn't know why exactly. It wasn't something he'd planned. But he came up out of sleep with unusual abruptness, the kind that doesn't feel like waking up so much as arriving, and before he'd even reached for his glasses his hands were open in front of his face, fingers spread, and he was feeling for something. He wasn't sure what he was feeling for. He just knew it was different. It took him a moment to understand what different meant. Because nothing looked different, the ward was the same pale stone, the same long rows of white-sheeted beds, the thin morning light coming through the high windows at the same angle it always did. Hermione was gone from the foot of his bed, which meant Pomfrey had eventually won that argument. His glasses were on the bedside table where he'd left them. But there was something in the center of his chest that hadn't been there before. Not a feeling exactly. More like a sound that had always been playing at the very edge of hearing and had suddenly, overnight, come up half a volume. A hum. Warm and low and present. He pressed 2 fingers against his sternum and felt his own heartbeat, and beneath it, or around it, or woven through it, something else entirely. His magic. He'd felt it before, obviously. Everyone felt their magic. It was the thing that made spells work, the thing that responded when you pointed a wand and meant something. But he'd always experienced it as slightly effortful, like reaching for something on a high shelf, like the glass was there between him and it that Pomfrey had described last night. Now the glass was cracked. Just cracked, not gone. 68 charms didn't dissolve overnight because a healer had named them. But something about being named, about being known, had shifted the geometry of it. He was aware of himself differently. He lay in the hospital bed and was aware of himself differently, and it was the strangest and most significant thing that had ever happened to him, which was saying something given that he'd found out he was a wizard 2 months ago. He put his glasses on and sat up. Pomfrey appeared at the end of the ward with the timing of someone who had been watching the beds from her office doorway. "Good morning. How do you feel?" "Different," he said. She looked at him carefully. "Different how?" "I don't know yet." She nodded, like this was the answer she'd expected. She came and sat on the edge of the opposite bed with her diagnostic wand already in hand, and ran a quick scan, nothing like the extended one from last night, just the kind that takes 30 seconds and tells you the basic status of things. She read the runes with her professional face on, the one that didn't give much away, but he thought he saw something in it that wasn't displeasure. "Some of the uppermost layers of the charms are already degrading," she said. "Which shouldn't be possible without active removal, but," she stopped. "But what?" "Your magical core is pushing against them," she said. "From the inside." She looked at him over the wand. "That's not something I've ever seen before. Ordinarily a layered suppression complex like this one is," she seemed to choose her next word carefully, "self-sustaining. The layers reinforce each other. They don't just degrade because the subject is aware of them." Harry considered this. "So my magic is trying to get out?" "Your magic has always been trying to get out," Pomfrey said. "It's just that now you know it's caged, and apparently that makes a difference." He looked down at his hands again. The hum in his chest was steady, patient, like something that had been waiting an extremely long time and had decided that a bit more waiting wasn't going to kill it. "What happens when they're all gone?" he asked. Pomfrey set her diagnostic wand on the bedside table. "I don't know precisely," she said. "I can tell you what the charms were suppressing. Growth, obviously. You'll likely have a significant physical growth period once they're fully removed, your body catching up to where it should be. Nutritional absorption. And your magical output." She paused. "The output suppression is the most significant component. Without it, your baseline magical signature will be," another careful word choice, "considerably stronger than what we've been working with." "How much stronger?" "Considerably," she said again, and this time it felt less like caution and more like honesty about the limits of what she could measure. He nodded. He didn't ask any more questions about that. He wasn't sure he needed to, the hum in his chest was already telling him things that numbers couldn't. "You can go to breakfast," Pomfrey said. "Come back this evening for another scan. Don't attempt any," she glanced at him, "experiments." "I won't," he said, and meant it. He had absolutely no intention of experimenting in any way that Pomfrey could observe. He thought he might try a few things in the privacy of the dormitory bathroom, but that was between him and his magic and didn't need to be anyone else's business yet. She handed him a small sealed bottle of amber potion that she said would support his system while his body adjusted, and she watched him drink it with the thoroughness of someone who had been tricked by children before. Then she sent him on his way. He walked out of the hospital wing into the corridor and the castle opened up around him, and the hum in his chest brightened by a fraction, like a compass needle settling toward north. Ron was waiting at the foot of the stairs to Gryffindor Tower with a piece of toast in each hand and an expression of concentrated loyalty that Harry found genuinely touching. "I saved you toast," Ron said. "I can see that. Hermione's already at the table." Ron fell into step beside him and handed over one of the pieces. "She gave me a very long explanation of what Section 14 of the Magical Child Protection Act means and I understood about half of it, but I think the important part is that Pomfrey's blown the whole thing open officially." "Yeah," Harry said. Ron looked sideways at him. Ron had a kind of social intelligence that he rarely received credit for. He was not Hermione's kind of smart, not the kind that manifested in grades and textbook knowledge, but he read people with an accuracy that Harry had come to rely on without ever quite articulating that he relied on it. Right now Ron was reading him and apparently deciding that questions were not the right tool. "How are you feeling?" Ron asked instead. "Strange," Harry said. "But good strange, I think. Good strange like finding out you're a wizard, good strange, or good strange like something more than that." Harry glanced at him. "More than that." Ron nodded and ate his toast and didn't push. This was one of the things Harry liked best about Ron Weasley. The Great Hall was its usual morning state, loud, warm, smelling of bacon and pumpkin juice, the enchanted ceiling showing a pale blue sky with streaks of high cloud that meant the storm from last night was fully gone. Harry sat down across from Hermione, who looked up from a dense piece of parchment she'd been reading with the focused intensity of a trainee solicitor who had just found a key clause. "Good morning," she said. "Are you all right?" "I told him about Section 14, Ron offered, sitting down and immediately loading his plate. "I see." Hermione set the parchment down. "Harry, Pomfrey filed the report this morning. I know because I was in the ward at 5:30 and she came back from the Ollery, and she had that look." "What look?" "The look of someone who has just committed to something that cannot be uncommitted to." Hermione pushed the parchment across the table. "I've been reading everything I can find about the DMLE's jurisdiction in cases like this. Section 14 mandatory reports trigger an automatic investigation. They can't shelve it, they can't bury it, they can't decide that something else is more pressing. It goes to the head of the DMLE directly." "Amelia Bones," Harry said, because Pomfrey had mentioned the name last night. "Amelia Bones," Hermione confirmed. By all accounts she's good. She's rigorous. She doesn't play politics the way some of the Wizengamot members do." She hesitated. "This is going to be big, Harry. When it comes out, and it will come out, it's going to be very, very big." Harry looked at the parchment. It was covered in Hermione's handwriting, margin notes and underlined passages and the occasional exclamation mark that she'd probably added without realizing. He thought about what Pomfrey had told him that morning about his magic pushing outward. He thought about the hum. He thought about the 18 months that some of the oldest charms dated back to, and what that meant, and who could have done it. He hadn't let himself finish that thought last night. He let himself finish it now. The answer arrived quietly and without drama, the way the answers to bad questions usually do. He looked up at the head table. Dumbledore was in his chair, speaking to Professor Flitwick, gesturing with animated hands at something that required both of them to look pleased about it. He looked like he always looked, benign, extraordinary, comfortable in the gravitational center of the room. Harry watched him for a moment. Then he looked back at his breakfast and started eating, because he was, it turned out, genuinely hungry in a way that felt different from his usual hunger, more thorough, more present, like his body was suddenly paying attention to the project of feeding itself with a new seriousness. Hermione was watching him. "You know who did it," she said quietly. "I think so," he said. "Are you?" She stopped. "No," he said. "I'm not all right with it. But I'm not going to fall apart over it either." He ate another piece of toast. "What's the Wizengamot likely to do?" Hermione blinked at the gearshift. Then she pulled the parchment back, because apparently they were doing this, and that was fine with her. "Depends on the evidence. If the magical signatures on the charms are traceable, if Pomfrey's documentation is solid, then it's not just a child welfare case, it's a criminal one. Sustained use of suppression magic on a minor without consent is a felony under," she consulted her notes, "the Magical Persons Act of 1958. Multiple counts. And if they can prove who placed them, there's no statute of limitations because some of them were placed while you were an infant, which puts it in the category of crimes against a non-consenting magical person under the age of magical majority." "Meaning?" "Meaning whoever did it goes to the Wizengamot," she said. "Regardless of who they are." Ron, who had been listening while systematically destroying a plate of eggs, set down his fork. Regardless of who they are, he repeated slowly, like the sentence was an architectural feature he was inspecting for structural integrity. You mean, even, regardless, Hermione said, and her voice was very steady and very young and very sure of itself. Ron picked his fork back up. He looked at the head table. He looked at Harry. He ate his eggs in silence for a moment, and then he said, right then, in the tone of someone who has decided that the world is a particular shape now and the useful thing is to move forward rather than argue with the shape of it. McGonagall found Harry between Transfiguration and lunch. Or rather, she positioned herself at the end of the corridor where he would have to walk past her and managed it so that it looked like he'd found her, which was a technique Harry suspected she'd developed over decades of dealing with students she needed to speak to but couldn't summon formally without creating exactly the kind of attention she wanted to avoid. Mr. Potter, she said. A word. Ron and Hermione exchanged a look and kept walking. McGonagall waited until the corridor was reasonably clear and then walked with Harry toward the window at the end, where the view looked out over the lake and the midday light was coming off the water in bright, flat sheets. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back and looked out at the lake for a moment before speaking. I assume, she said, that Madame Pomfrey spoke with you last night. Yes, Harry said. And you understand the significance of what she found? Yes. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. She was not, Harry had learned, a woman who spoke when she didn't have something to say. The silences between her sentences were not awkward, they were structural, load-bearing. I want you to know, she said at last, that I was not aware of this. Not any part of it. Had I been, she stopped. He heard something shift in her voice, not much, just a splinter of something that in anyone else he'd have called grief. I want that to be absolutely clear. I believe you, Harry said. She looked at him then, sharply, as if she'd expected to have to work harder for that. Do you? You're the one who told Pomfrey to scan us, he said. Last night, after the troll. I heard you. Standard protocol, you said. Yes. You didn't know what she'd find. No. I certainly did not. But now you do, Harry said, and you haven't told me to stay quiet about it or suggested there might be a reasonable explanation or said anything about context or the greater good. He looked at her steadily. So yes. I believe you. Something moved across McGonagall's face that was complicated and brief and seemed to involve several emotions arriving simultaneously and having to negotiate the right of way. She turned back to the window. Pomfrey's report will reach Madame Bones today, she said. The DMLE will launch a formal investigation. When that happens, you will likely be asked to give testimony about your experiences, your health, your magical development as you've experienced it. You don't have to do this alone. You are entitled to an independent magical guardian for the proceedings. I don't have one, Harry said. My aunt and uncle are muggles. They can't, no, McGonagall agreed. But as your head of house, I can serve in that capacity. She paused. If you want me to. Harry considered her profile, the sharp line of her jaw, the set of her mouth, the way she was looking at the lake with the particular focus of a woman who was doing something emotionally difficult and refusing to let it look difficult. Yes, he said. I'd want that. She nodded, once, briskly. Good. Then that's settled. She turned from the window with the manner of someone recapping herself in professional composure like it was a coat. In the meantime, you will attend your classes, you will behave normally, or as normally as you are capable of, which I'll grant is not always the standard definition, and you will not discuss the specifics of the investigation with anyone outside of your immediate friends. What about Dumbledore? Harry asked. The pause was very short, but it was there. What about him? He came to see Pomfrey this morning. I heard him leave. He'd been half awake, lying still with his eyes closed in the way he'd learned at the Dursleys when he didn't want to be noticed. She didn't sound like she told him much. She wouldn't have, McGonagall said. Poppy Pomfrey is the most professionally rigorous person in this castle, and she is absolutely not, she would not compromise an official investigation. She paused. As for Dumbledore, he will have to account for himself. That is now, by law, out of anyone's hands but the DMLE's. She turned to go. Professor, Harry said. She stopped. When they remove the charms, the 68. What do you think happens? McGonagall looked at him for a long moment with those sharp, direct eyes. I think, Mr. Potter, she said carefully, that we are going to find out what you are actually capable of. And I think, another pause, shorter this time, I think it is going to be considerable. She walked away down the corridor, her heels precise on the stone, and Harry stood at the window and looked at the lake and felt the hum in his chest and thought, yes. Potions was last period and Snape was in one of his moods. He always seemed to be in some variety of mood, but today's flavor was particularly compressed. He moved through the dungeon classroom with a coiled, crackling energy that made the second years flinch slightly when he passed their cauldrons, and his commentary on their work was cutting in a way that had less to do with teaching and more to do with the fact that something else was clearly occupying the majority of his attention and his students were suffering the ambient pressure of it. Harry worked on his forgetfulness potion with the steady, methodical focus he'd been developing over the last 2 months. He was not a natural in potions, the kind of intuitive magical touch that made flying feel effortless didn't seem to translate to the precise, patient chemistry of potion making. But the hum in his chest was different today, more present, and when he looked at the instructions on the board and then looked at his cauldron, something about the relationship between the two felt more connected. Less like following steps in a foreign language and more like reading in his native one. His potion was turning the correct shade of light blue at the right stage when it was supposed to still be murky green. He stared at it. Neville, at the bench beside him, whose own cauldron had developed a faint and worrying smell, glanced over and went wide-eyed. How did you? That's perfect color. I don't know, Harry said honestly. 10 points from Gryffindor, Snape said from directly behind him, and Harry had genuinely not heard him approach, for conducting private conversations during, he stopped. He was looking at Harry's cauldron. The silence lasted about 2 seconds, which in Snape's classroom was enough to make the entire room go still. What did you do differently? Snape said. His voice was carefully inflectionless. Nothing, Harry said. I followed the instructions. You followed the instructions. Snape looked at the cauldron and then at Harry, and whatever he was thinking was locked behind an expression so controlled that it gave nothing away except the fact that something was happening behind it. The instructions as written produce a grade 2 blue at this stage only if the stirring speed from the 3rd step is maintained precisely through the 6th. Your stirring speed in step 3 was inconsistent. I was watching. And yet, Harry said. It came out with a flatness that surprised even him, not rude, not provocative, just factual. A statement of what was true. The potion was perfect. He had made it. That was what had happened. Snape looked at him for a long beat with eyes that were doing something complicated and involuntary that had nothing to do with classroom discipline. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said quietly. For a correctly prepared 6th stage potion. And he moved away to destroy Neville's afternoon instead. Ron caught Harry's eye from across the bench. He was trying not to grin and mostly failing. Harry looked back at his potion. The hum in his chest was warm and very, very steady. The letter came at dinner. Not to Harry, to Dumbledore. A ministry owl landed at the head table while the pudding was appearing, and anyone watching closely would have seen the headmaster open it, read it, fold it once, and set it on the table beside his plate with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who has just been told something that requires the whole of their self-control to receive without visible reaction. Hermione was watching closely. She elbowed Harry. Look, she said quietly. He looked. Dumbledore's face was its usual warm, composed mask, but the letter sat folded on the table and he did not touch it again, and he did not, for the remainder of dinner, quite manage the usual animated conversation with the teachers on either side of him. McGonagall was at the far end of the head table. She had not looked at Dumbledore once since sitting down, which was unusual enough that Ron noticed it from across the hall and leaned in to report it as though they were running surveillance. "McGonagall's ignoring him," Ron said. "She's talked to Flitwick 3 times and Sprout twice, and she hasn't looked at the headmaster once, and they sit 4 seats apart." "I know," Harry said. "That's very weird for them." "I know." "Should we be, Ron?" Hermione said, "eat your pudding." Ron ate his pudding, but he kept watching the head table with the thoughtful expression of someone assembling a puzzle that he wasn't sure he had all the pieces for yet. Harry ate his pudding too. He was hungry in the new way again, genuinely, thoroughly hungry, his body working through food with an attention it hadn't previously given to the task. He had 3 helpings of the treacle tart, which was not his usual behavior, and Hermione noted it without comment except to quietly move the serving dish slightly closer to him. After dinner, walking up through the crowded corridors toward the common room, Harry paused at a window on the second-floor landing and looked out at the grounds. The evening was coming in blue and cold over the forbidden forest, the lake going dark, the first stars appearing. The castle hummed around him, the actual stone hum of it, spells woven into mortar, magic in the foundations, Hogwarts being Hogwarts in the way it always was. But tonight he could feel it more distinctly. He pressed one hand flat against the window glass and the hum in his chest resonated with it, very faintly, like 2 notes on the same string. He could feel the castle the way you feel a room when you walk into it, not thinking about it, just knowing the dimensions, the temperature, the quality of the air. "Harry?" Hermione was 3 steps up, looking back at him. "Coming," he said, and took his hand off the glass. The resonance faded to a background thing, barely perceptible. But it had been there. He filed it away and followed his friends up to the common room. At 9:17 that evening, Madame Pomfrey received a reply from Amelia Bones. It was written in a precise, slightly angular hand on official DMLE parchment, sealed with the department's Phoenix and Scales emblem, and it was very short: "Madame Pomfrey, report received and evidential record verified. Investigation opened under case reference 91-1126 MCP. I will be at Hogwarts Thursday. Please ensure all original diagnostic records are available, and please do not discuss the case specifics with any party beyond those who must know. That includes administrative staff. A. Bones, Head, DMLE." Pomfrey read it twice. Then she set it in the locked drawer of her desk with the rest of the case documentation, poured herself a small measure of fire whiskey, which she permitted herself only on evenings that genuinely warranted it, and sat for a while with the glass in her hands and the quiet ward beyond her office door and her own thoughts for company. Thursday was 2 days away. She thought about Harry Potter and his hands open in front of his face in the dawnlight, feeling for something that had always been his. She thought about the 18-month-old who'd had those first charms placed on him with an expertise and a coldness that still made something twist in her chest when she looked at the documentation. She thought about what Dumbledore had said before he'd left her office: "He is extraordinary." She thought about how extraordinary he might have been. She finished the fire whiskey, rinsed the glass, and went to do her evening rounds. Harry was sitting up in bed in the dormitory. She couldn't see him, obviously, but she knew with the particular sixth sense of a long-term school healer that he was awake. That he was thinking. That the thing in his chest was running at a frequency that sleep couldn't quite catch. She hoped he was all right. Then she corrected herself: she hoped he was far better than all right. She hoped he was beginning to understand, in the slow private way that real understanding happens, that the cage was coming down. And she suspected, from the pattern of the charm degradation in that morning scan, from the way his magical core was pressing outward with a steady and patient and completely unstoppable force, that it was only a matter of time before coming down became gone entirely. She wondered, not for the first time, if Dumbledore had any real comprehension of what he'd been suppressing. She rather thought he did. She rather thought that was the point. 2 floors up, in the Gryffindor dormitory, Harry Potter lay in the dark with his eyes open and his hand on his own sternum and listened to the quiet, constant hum of a magic that was finally waking up. He was not afraid of it. He was, for the first time in his life, exactly the opposite. Chapter 3, The Machinery Moves. Amelia Bones arrived on Thursday morning before breakfast. She didn't announce herself. There was no owl ahead of time saying I'll be there at 7, no formal procession through the front gates with ministry escorts and official paperwork held aloft. One moment the corridor outside the hospital wing was empty and the next it wasn't, and the woman standing in it was short and broad-shouldered with iron-gray hair cut to the jaw, a monocle on a thin chain, and the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years deciding what was worth her time and had gotten very good at the calculation. She knocked on Pomfrey's office door exactly twice. Pomfrey opened it within seconds, which meant she'd been awake and waiting, and the two women looked at each other with the brief, assessing look of professionals who have heard enough about each other to form an opinion and are now checking it against reality. "Madam Pomfrey," Bones said. "Madam Bones. Come in." The meeting lasted an hour and 20 minutes. Pomfrey presented the full evidential record, every diagnostic scan, the origin signature analysis, the timeline reconstruction showing the layering sequence of all 68 charms from the oldest at 18 months to the most recent, which had been placed a year and a half ago, when Harry had been 10. She walked Bones through the medical analysis of each charm's function, the combined suppressive effect of the full array, and the 3 deep layer signatures that had been clear enough to identify despite the deliberate obscuring work that had been done on the outer layers. Bones listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked 3 questions. Each question was precise, technical, and aimed directly at the load-bearing points of the evidence, the places where a defense might try to find a crack. When Pomfrey answered each one cleanly, Bones made a note on her parchment with the economical handwriting of someone who'd been taking case notes since before Pomfrey had qualified as a healer. Then she sat back in the chair and looked at the sealed evidential record hovering in the air between them. "The 3 readable signatures," she said. "You formally attributed them." "In the evidential record, yes," Pomfrey said. "Not verbally, until now, because you asked me not to discuss case specifics." She held Bones's gaze. "They belong to Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore." The silence was very professional and very brief. "Right," Bones said. She made another note. "I'll need 2 things from you before I leave today. First, a signed and witnessed copy of your formal attribution statement. Second, access to the boy for an independent diagnostic examination, my department's healer, not you, no offense." "None taken," Pomfrey said. "I expected it. The independent examination protects the integrity of the case," Bones said. "If we're going to the Wizengamot with this, and we are going to the Wizengamot with this, the defense will attack the evidence chain at every point they can find. I want no ambiguity." She stood, straightening her robes, clicking her monocle back into place with a practiced gesture. "Who else in this castle knows the specifics?" "Myself. The boy. 2 of his friends were in the ward during the initial discovery, but I don't believe they know the full scope." Pomfrey paused. "And the headmaster knows I filed a report. I told him so directly." "How did he receive that information?" Pomfrey thought about Dumbledore's face in her office, the 3-second pause before "Good Lord," the way his eyes had moved. "With considerable self-control," she said. Bones absorbed this. "Has he tried to contact you again since?" "No." "Has he attempted to access the ward records?" "He would have found them sealed and integrity charmed." "That's not the same as not trying." Pomfrey was quiet for a moment. "There was a password attempt on the record cabinet ward at 2 in the morning on Wednesday," she said. "I have the attempt logged. It failed." Bones looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. "Thank you," she said, and wrote it down. Harry found out Bones was in the castle the same way he found out most things, Hermione told him, having found out from the castle itself, or rather from the particular quality of attention that moved through the student body when something official was happening that the adults didn't want students to know about. It was the whispers in the corridor after charms, the way 2 fifth-year prefects went quiet when he walked past, the way Professor Flitwick had been slightly distracted during the lesson, happy, Flitwick distracted, the kind where he was thinking about something rather than anxious about it, but distracted nonetheless. "Someone important is here," Hermione said, walking fast beside him toward the hospital wing where Pomfrey had sent a note asking for Harry at morning break. "I think it's the DMLE. How do you figure?" "Because the heads of most other departments wouldn't require Pomfrey to send a private note rather than coming through the school administrative channel. The DMLE bypasses institutional hierarchy when there's an active investigation. Standard protocol under Section 14, Ron said from Harry's other side. Hermione blinked. "Yes, actually. I've been reading," Ron said, with the mild satisfaction of a person who has produced a rabbit from an unexpected hat. The note from Pomfrey had said, "Mr. Potter, please come to the hospital wing at morning break. Bring no one." Harry had told Ron and Hermione this, and they had looked at each other and fallen in on either side of him anyway, and he had not told them to stop, because he found he had no interest in doing this alone, and the note had said bring no one in a way that felt more like caution than order. Pomfrey met them at the door. "I said," she began. "They know," Harry said. "They're not coming in." Pomfrey looked at Ron and Hermione, who arranged their faces into expressions of cooperative innocence. "I'll be in the corridor," Hermione said, in the tone of someone who will absolutely not be eavesdropping and yet somehow always knows what happened in meetings she wasn't in. Pomfrey let Harry through and closed the door. Inside, a woman Harry didn't recognize was standing in the center of the ward. She was shorter than he'd expected, something about the crispness of her presence had made him expect someone taller, with a monocle that caught the light when she turned and eyes behind it that were doing a rapid, comprehensive assessment of him that he could actually feel, like a scan. "Harry Potter," she said. "Yes. I'm Amelia Bones. I'm the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement." She said it without ceremony, just fact. "I'm here because of a report filed by Madame Pomfrey about your medical condition. I need to conduct an independent examination, different healer, same diagnostic approach, independent result. That result gets added to the evidence chain." She paused. "Do you understand what that means?" "It means the case is stronger if someone else finds the same thing," Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "Exactly." Something shifted in her expression, very slightly, almost imperceptible. "Sit down." He sat on the nearest bed. The healer she'd brought, a young woman with close-cropped hair and formal St. Mungo's robes who had been standing quietly to one side, stepped forward with a diagnostic wand that was slightly different from Pomfrey's, longer, made of a darker wood. "This will take about 10 minutes, the healer said. "You'll feel a mild warmth but nothing uncomfortable." "All right," Harry said. The scan was thorough. The healer worked in silence, her expression focused and professional, and the runes she generated she transferred immediately to a sealed parchment record that she handed to Bones without showing to anyone else. Bones read it, made a note, and set it on the bed beside Harry. 51 still active, she said. Down from 68 in 4 days. They're degrading. Pomfrey said my magic is pushing against them, Harry said. Your magic, Bones said carefully, is doing something I've not seen in 22 years of this work. She looked at him with the straightforward, direct quality that seemed to be her default mode. I'm going to ask you a question that is part of the official record. You can decline to answer, but anything you say I will write down and it will be admissible. Ask, Harry said. Have you always experienced your magic as limited? Difficult to access? As though something was, in the way, Harry said. She wrote it down. And now? He thought about it honestly. Less so, he said. It's getting clearer. Do you know who placed the charms on you? Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about Dumbledore's eyes at the welcome feast, the steady, warm way they'd moved over the students, settling. The grandfather of it. The absolute assurance. I have a strong suspicion, he said. I'm not asking your suspicion, Bones said. I'm asking what you know. Then I don't know, he said. Not as a fact. Good, she said, and the word had approval in it. That's the right answer. She capped her quill. Here's what happens next. I'll be presenting the evidential record to the Wizengamot's criminal chamber within the next week. Given the nature and duration of the offense, and given the identity of the attributed party, there will be a formal summons issued. She paused. You'll be called to testify. I know. It'll be public. The Wizengamot's criminal proceedings are public record. She held his gaze steadily. It'll be in the Prophet within a day of the summons being issued. There will be considerable attention. I know that too, Harry said. Bones studied him. He had the sense she was testing for something, not for weakness exactly, more the way you test a rope before you put weight on it. How old are you? She asked, though she clearly already knew. 11, he said. You're handling this with more composure than most adults I interview, she said. It wasn't flattery. It was an observation, delivered the way she delivered everything, straight, without wrapper. I've been not allowed to react to things my whole life, Harry said. It makes you good at absorbing information. He paused. It doesn't mean I'm fine with it. She looked at him for a long beat. Then she stood, tucked her notes under her arm, and gave him a short, decisive nod. Professor McGonagall will be your independent guardian for the proceedings. She's already filed the relevant documentation with my office. She moved toward the door and then stopped. One more thing, Mr. Potter. If anyone at all, attempts to speak to you about this investigation, about the evidence, about what you've told me today, you tell Madame Pomfrey or Professor McGonagall immediately. Do not have that conversation. Even, he started. Anyone, she said. He understood what anyone covered. Yes, ma'am, he said. The corner of her mouth moved in something that was almost, a smile. Good lad, she said, and left. The thing about Hogwarts was that it was terrible at keeping secrets. Not because anyone was deliberately indiscreet, but because 800 students in a confined magical space generated a kind of collective intelligence that was faster than any individual component of it. By lunchtime, the fact of a ministry official's visit was general knowledge, dressed in 17 different theories. The ministry was inspecting the troll incident for safety violations, there was an Auror investigation into one of the teachers, a student had done something illegal with a port key, Dumbledore was being awarded something, there was a problem with the castle wards. None of the theories touched the truth, which was, Harry thought, sitting at the Gryffindor table and eating his way through an actually substantial lunch, probably the only benefit of the truth being genuinely unthinkable to most people. Who could imagine it, after all? Who looked at Albus Dumbledore, defeater of Grindelwald, Order of Merlin First Class, Supreme Mugwump, Chief Warlock, the man whose name children's parents whispered with reverence and whose face graced every chocolate frog card, and thought, child abuser. Harry pushed the thought aside. He wasn't going to use that phrase, wasn't going to let it become the frame through which he understood things, because if he let it be that frame then the whole thing became about his feelings and his damage and what had been done to him, and that was not, he knew with a clarity that surprised him, what he wanted this to be about. He wanted it to be about accountability. There was a difference. You're very quiet, Hermione said. I'm thinking. You're allowed to be upset, you know, she said, in the slightly careful tone of someone who'd been rehearsing the sentence. I would be. I am, actually, and it wasn't even done to me. I know, he said. I'll be upset later. Right now there are things to understand. She studied him for a moment, and then she did something surprising. She reached across the table and briefly put her hand over his and then pulled it back and looked firmly at her food, which was, for Hermione, an enormous gesture, roughly equivalent to anyone else delivering a fully composed speech about feelings. He appreciated it. Ron, who had witnessed this and processed it with his social intelligence, said nothing and passed Harry the bread basket. This was also an enormous gesture. Different type. Harry took the bread. The summons was issued Friday morning. It arrived via ministry owl to the headmaster's office. Harry knew this because by Friday afternoon the owl's arrival had been witnessed by 2 sixth-years who'd been near the gargoyle on the 3rd floor, and the story had moved through the castle with the velocity of something people knew was important even if they didn't know why. Dumbledore was required to appear before the Wizengamot's criminal chamber on the following Tuesday at 10 in the morning to answer questions related to an active investigation under case reference 91-1126 MCP. He accepted the summons. Harry knew this not because anyone told him, but because the castle felt different on Friday evening, a kind of shifted weight feeling, like a large piece of furniture had been moved in a room above. He was getting more attuned to the building day by day, the way the stones registered significant things, the way the magic in the walls ran slightly warmer or cooler depending on the emotional weather of its inhabitants. It was a skill he hadn't had a week ago, and now he had it the way you have a new tooth in the gap where the old one fell out, just there, suddenly, present and functional. He tried not to think too hard about what else was coming online. He mostly succeeded. What he didn't succeed at was charms on Friday afternoon, where he performed the levitation charm that had been Flitwick's lesson for the week, and instead of the standard, manageable elevation they'd been practicing, textbook said 18 inches maximum for first years, his feather rose steadily to the ceiling 20 feet above and stayed there, rotating slowly, as if it had found somewhere it liked. The entire class went quiet. "Mr. Potter," Flitwick said, in a voice pitched considerably higher than normal. "Sorry," Harry said. Don't apologize. Can you bring it down?" Harry focused on the feather. It came down, not drifting, the way a normal Wingardium Leviosa resolution went, but smoothly, with a directional precision that had nothing to do with the swish and flick technique. It settled on his desk. The class was still quiet. 5 points to Gryffindor, Flitwick said, after a pause in which he appeared to be doing internal arithmetic of some kind. His eyes were bright and alive in a way that suggested he was genuinely delighted and was working hard at being professionally measured about it. And, yes. 5 points. He moved on to the next student very deliberately, but Harry caught him glancing back twice with the expression of a man who has just seen something he is going to think about for a while. Ron was staring at the feather on Harry's desk. "You barely moved your wand," he said. "I know. That was nothing like what we've been practicing." "I know, Ron." "How?" Harry looked at him honestly. "I don't know," he said. "It just came out differently." It had felt like the difference between shouting across a noisy room and speaking in a quiet one. The charm had always been there. He'd just been doing it in a very noisy room. Saturday brought Quidditch practice and the first real sign that the news, whatever form it was traveling in, had reached beyond Hogwarts. Oliver would called practice for 9 in the morning, and it was a sharp, cold, brilliant day with high clouds and excellent visibility, which would treat it as a personal gift from the universe acknowledging his dedication to the sport. Harry was in the air within 5 minutes, and the moment he was on a broom and in the sky the hum in his chest became something else entirely, something expansive, unfettered, as if the open air gave it room to stretch that the stone corridors didn't. He was faster. He'd been fast before. He'd been fast enough that McGonagall had pulled him off a broom mid-flight 2 months ago and marched him to wood like a treasure she'd found in a corridor. But that had been fast the way that a car is fast when you've only ever walked. This was different. He opened up the throttle on a dive and the ground came up at him with a speed that should have been alarming and wasn't, because he knew with a precision that bypassed thought, exactly where the snitch was going to move, when to turn, how much sky between him and it. He caught it 4 times in 20 minutes. Wood landed beside him after the 4th catch and stood there with his broom in one hand and his expression cycling through several things at speed. "Harry," he said. "What's happened to you?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, last week you were the best first-year seeker I'd ever seen and this week you're the best seeker I've ever seen. Full stop. Of any year." Wood gestured at the air. "You took that last dive at a speed where I was genuinely concerned for your structural integrity as a human person." "I felt fine," Harry said. "I know you felt fine, that's not the point," Wood stopped, visibly recalibrating. He was a fundamentally practical person who organized his inner life around Quidditch strategy, and his inner life was currently having a heated argument about whether to be worried or ecstatic, and ecstatic was winning. Right. You're completely fine. This is completely fine. Don't change whatever you're doing. He walked away, already making notes on his strategy parchment. Hermione was in the stands with a book, which she'd closed at some point during Harry's third catch and hadn't reopened. When Harry landed, she came down to the pitch with a look on her face that was calculating and wondering in equal measure. "Your speed has increased significantly," she said. "Yes. The charms are still degrading." 43 left, according to Pomfrey's Thursday scan. He stowed his Nimbus 2000 and ran a hand through his hair, which was doing what it always did regardless of effort. 5 less every day, roughly. And your magic is getting clearer proportionally. Seems like. She walked beside him off the pitch and toward the castle. "Harry, I've been thinking about what Bones said, about the Wizengamot hearing being public." She paused. "The wizarding world has a very fixed idea of who you are. The boy who lived. Small. Modest. Unthreatening." She said it without softening it, because softening it would have been patronizing, and she knew him well enough to know he didn't want that. "What happens to that narrative when it turns out I was suppressed and I'm not actually modest?" He smiled slightly. "I expect some people will have a hard time with it. Some people will feel cheated," she said. "They had a story about you." "That's their problem," Harry said, with a simplicity that made her blink. "I didn't write their story. I just got to be in it." He looked at the castle rising ahead of them, the towers catching the morning light. "Let them adjust." Hermione looked at him for a long moment and then nodded, slowly, with the expression of someone updating a model they'd been working from. "Right," she said. "Let them adjust." The weekend passed with a deceptive normalcy that Harry suspected was the calm specific to the eye of things. He studied. He ate, a lot, still, his body working through food with the thoroughness of someone making up for a decade of being malnourished by charms that had been telling his system not to properly absorb what he ate. He slept well, which surprised him. He'd expected the knowing to produce insomnia, but instead it produced the opposite, a deep, clean, untroubled sleep that left him rested in ways he hadn't experienced before. Sunday afternoon he sat in the common room and practiced charms with Hermione, low-level things, the first-year syllabus. Each one came with that same quality of cleared air, less effort than it had been, the magic finding the shape of the spell more readily, more precisely. Hermione watched him with careful attention and made notes in the margin of her charms textbook that she'd never used for margin notes before. "You're not struggling at all," she said, after he'd performed a lumos that produced a light significantly brighter than the standard spell should manage. "Not with any of them." "I know. Harry, that's remarkable. You've been here 2 months and you're performing these like a third year. Or like a first year who isn't being suppressed," he said. She wrote something in her margin. "What does it feel like?" He considered the question properly, because it deserved a proper answer. "Like, when you know a word in a foreign language but you've only ever read it and never heard it spoken. And then you hear someone say it and it just clicks into place and you can't understand how you didn't have it before." He paused. "It feels like that. Like I've had the words the whole time and I've just been reading them off a page, and now I can actually say them." Hermione looked at him with her pen still. "That's a good description," she said softly. "You look worried," he said. "I'm not worried," she said. "I'm recalibrating. Still. I suspect I'll be recalibrating for a while," she admitted. "My model of the world included Dumbledore as one of the foundations. The kind of person you could build your understanding of good and evil around, and use as a reference point." She looked at the margin notes in her textbook. "When foundations move, everything built on top of them needs to be re-examined. It's just thorough work." "And you're thorough," he said. "Extremely," she said, with a very small, very real smile. Ron appeared from the direction of the boys' staircase with a chest set under his arm and an expression that suggested he'd been listening to the last exchange from a distance and had decided the timing was right to arrive. He sat down on the rug in front of the fire, set up the board, and looked at Harry. "Play." "I'll lose," Harry said. "Probably," Ron agreed. "Still, though." Harry moved to the rug and they played, and Hermione read, and the fire was warm and the Sunday afternoon was quiet, and it was the last quiet afternoon for a very long time. Monday happened the way Mondays do, class, meals, the ordinary machinery of school, and then it was Monday night and Harry was lying in his bed thinking about Tuesday, and for the first time he let himself feel the thing he'd been managing all week. Not fear. He'd been honest with himself about that. He wasn't afraid of the hearing, wasn't afraid of Dumbledore, wasn't afraid of whatever the wizarding world was going to do with the information once it had it. He didn't have the particular fear that comes from caring too much about what people think, because he'd never been extended the luxury of caring about that. The Dursleys had cured him of it efficiently. What he felt was anticipatory. The way the sky felt before a storm, when the air pressure changed and the birds went quiet and everything was poised on the edge of a change that was going to be total and irreversible. He pressed his hand flat to his sternum. 31 charms left, according to Pomfrey's Sunday scan. 31, down from 68 in less than a week. The rate of degradation had increased as each successive layer fell, each one that went made the next one slightly more exposed to the pressure from below. The hum was not quiet now. It was present and warm and growing, and sometimes when he was very still he could feel it reaching outward in ways that he was still learning to map. He could feel the dormitory around him, the sleeping presences of his 4 dormitory mates, Dean's alarm clock, the particular magical quality of Neville's Mimbulus Mimbletonia that sat on the windowsill and had a faint warm signature like all living things. He could feel the edges of the common room below. He thought about what he was going to say at the hearing. He thought about Bones's question, "Have you always experienced your magic as limited?" and his answer, and the way she'd written it down with the deliberate efficiency of someone building something brick by brick. He thought about Dumbledore in the chair across from Pomfrey's desk, saying he is extraordinary with what might, in another context, have looked like genuine feeling. He had turned that sentence over all week, looking at it from different angles, and he kept arriving at the same conclusion. The tragedy of it was that he believed it. Dumbledore had believed Harry was extraordinary and had suppressed him anyway, which was worse than not believing it, which was worse than doing it out of ignorance or spite. He'd done it because he'd decided that an extraordinary Harry Potter was a dangerous one. That the prophecy required a particular kind of boy, controllable, humble, willing to sacrifice, and had simply engineered that boy when the natural one proved too powerful to guarantee compliance. Harry stared at the dark ceiling and understood this with a clarity that was not comforting. He understood it without being destroyed by it, which was also not something he'd expected. He thought it might be the hum. The constant present warmth of his magic running truer day by day, reminding him at a frequency below conscious thought that whatever had been done to him had not worked. Not completely. Not permanently. He was still here. He was increasingly, decisively, irrevocably here. He closed his eyes and listened to the castle around him, the deep stone breathing of it, the magic in the walls running warm through the night, and he let himself be tired, and let sleep come, because tomorrow was going to be the kind of day that required him to be absolutely present for every minute of it. Tomorrow, the machinery of wizarding justice was going to turn toward Albus Dumbledore for the first time in its history. Harry intended to be ready. Chapter 4, The Hearing. The Wizengamot's criminal chamber was underground. Harry hadn't known this until McGonagall told him on the ministry elevator going down, her voice carrying the careful, informational tone of someone who understood that practical details were more useful than emotional preparation. Level 10. Below the regular courtrooms, below the holding cells, below the places most ministry employees went about their ordinary working days. The kind of depth that felt deliberate, as though whoever had designed the building had decided that serious criminal proceedings required the weight of the earth above them. The elevator opened into a stone corridor lit by blue-flamed torches that cast no shadows, only a flat, even light that made everything look very clear and very cold. Bones was waiting for them with two aurors flanking her, a tall woman with close-cropped locks named Moody Trainee Shacklebolt, and a shorter man Harry didn't know. Bones looked at Harry and gave him the same short assessing nod she'd given him in the hospital wing. He gave it back. "We have 20 minutes before proceedings open," she said, moving immediately into practical mode. "Harry, you'll be in the public gallery until you're called. Professor McGonagall will be with you. When you're called, you come down to the witness chair in the center of the chamber floor. You answer what you're asked. If I think a question is improper, I'll object and you wait." She paused. "Don't volunteer information beyond what's asked. Don't explain yourself. Don't fill silences." "All right," Harry said. "He's done nothing wrong," McGonagall said, with a firmness that suggested she was saying it as much for herself as anyone. "I know that," Bones said. "I'm telling him how to be useful." She looked at Harry again. "Are you ready?" "Yes," Harry said, and meant it. Bones moved them down the corridor, and Harry walked through the blue torchlight thinking about exactly nothing, because he had found over the last week that thinking too much about imminent large events was counterproductive. Better to be empty before them. Better to arrive present. The hum in his chest was steady and warm. 24 charms left as of this morning's scan. He was less than halfway back to himself and already the difference was extraordinary. He wondered, with a detachment that surprised him, what the full thing would feel like. McGonagall put a hand briefly on his shoulder as they approached the chamber doors. A quick, firm pressure, and then she took it away. "You are not on trial here," she said. "I know," he said. "I want you to actually know it, not just say it." He looked at her. Her expression was doing its controlled complicated thing, the thing where several strong feelings were being managed by a very capable professional. "I know," he said again, more slowly. "I'm not the one who has to answer for anything today." Something in her face settled slightly. "Not all the way, but some." "Good," she said, and they went in. The Wizengamot's criminal chamber was circular and tiered, cut from grey stone, with the public gallery running in a horseshoe around the upper level and the chamber floor below where a single chair sat in the center. The chair had chains attached to its arms, coiled and inactive but present, a detail Harry filed without emotion. 3 tiers of Wizengamot members faced it in dark plum robes, their names placarded in front of them, 40-odd witches and wizards ranging from ancient to middle-aged, presided over by a chief warlock's chair that today held not Dumbledore, obviously, but a heavyset which named Griselda Marchbanks, who was very old and had the quality of someone who had seen enough history that very little of it surprised her anymore. The public gallery was half full. Harry had expected more, had expected the story to have broken before the hearing, the way Bones had warned him it would, but the formal summons had used the case reference number rather than names, and the prophet apparently hadn't cracked the connection yet. There were journalists in the gallery, Harry could see them by their quick quotes, quills and the particular forward lean of professional attention, but they were here on speculation, not confirmed information. That was going to change in about 10 minutes. Harry sat in the second row of the gallery with McGonagall on his left, rigid and straight-backed, and a space on his right that no one had filled. He looked down at the chamber floor. The single chair sat empty in that flat blue light. The chains were still. He thought, I have sat in worse places than this and I have been in worse situations than this. I was 11 months old and Voldemort killed my parents in front of me and I survived it. I can handle a chair in a courtroom. The thought was not self-dramatizing. It was just factual calibration, the kind of mental arithmetic that had gotten him through a decade of the Dursleys, through a troll at Halloween, through the revelation that the most powerful man in the wizarding world had been systematically engineering his limitations since before he could walk. He could handle today. Bones entered from a side door and took her position at the front of the chamber, her case documentation on the table before her. She didn't look at the gallery. She arranged her papers with the focused economy of someone ready to begin. Then the side door on the opposite end of the chamber opened, and Albus Dumbledore walked in. The room changed. That was the only way Harry could describe it afterward. The room changed the way a room changes when a fireplace is extinguished, not dark, but the specific warmth that had been there wasn't there anymore, replaced by something cooler and more careful. 40 Wizengamot members adjusted their postures. The journalists leaned forward. McGonagall, beside Harry, went utterly still. Dumbledore walked to the center chair without hurrying. He was in dark grey robes, not his usual vibrant colors, Harry noticed, something more subdued, and he looked exactly as he always looked, tall, composed, carrying the full weight of his history with him like a garment. He sat in the chair and folded his hands in his lap and looked at Griselda Marchbanks with an expression of attentive patience. The chains did not move. Marchbanks looked at them with an expression of someone noting a technicality without feeling any need to address it. "This chamber is in session," she said, in a voice like stone on stone. Case reference 91-1126 MCP. Amelia Bones of the DMLE will present. Proceed. Bones stood. This investigation concerns the sustained use of suppression magic on a minor in violation of Section 7 of the Magical Persons Act 1958, and Section 14 and 22 of the Magical Child Protection Act 1976. The minor in question is Harry James Potter, currently 11 years of age, first-year student at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. She let that land. The offenses were discovered last Tuesday evening following a routine medical diagnostic examination by Madame Poppy Pomfrey, school matron at Hogwarts. The room had been quiet before. Now it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that has weight to it, that presses in from the sides. The examination revealed 68 distinct malnutrition charms layered on Mr. Potter's magical core and physical body, Bones continued. Independent examination by a St. Mungo's healer confirmed the finding. The charms collectively suppress physical growth, nutritional absorption, and magical output. They are not of therapeutic origin. Their layered architecture is consistent with long-term intentional suppression, not medical management. She paused. The magical signatures of the 3 earliest charms, placed when Mr. Potter was approximately 18 months old, have been formally attributed to the accused. Dumbledore's expression did not change. At this time, Bones said, the department requests that the Wizengamot hear testimony from 3 witnesses, Madame Pomfrey, the independent St. Mungo's healer, and Mr. Harry Potter himself. The department also requests permission to introduce the evidential record compiled under Integrity Charm. She sat down. Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore. "Do you have counsel?" "I represent myself," Dumbledore said. His voice was exactly as it always was, warm, measured, the voice of a man who had addressed thousands of students, dozens of Wizengamots, a century of gatherings. "I am familiar enough with these proceedings." "You are not the chief warlock of this body today," Marchbanks said. "You're the accused. You'll comport yourself accordingly." "Of course," Dumbledore said, and inclined his head. Marchbanks called Pomfrey first. Pomfrey testified for 40 minutes. She was, Harry thought, extraordinary. She presented the diagnostic findings with a clinical precision that left no ambiguity, no gap for alternative interpretation, no softness that could be pried open. She had dates, she had the full rune analysis, she had the growth trajectory charts showing where Harry's physical development had deviated from magical norm at 18 months and remained consistently suppressed thereafter. She had the nutritional absorption data, the magical output baseline, the calcification patterns showing long-term charming. She was asked by one of the Wizengamot members, a florid-faced man named Fudge who seemed perpetually slightly distressed, as though the world kept surprising him unpleasantly, whether there was any legitimate medical use for the array of charms found on Mr. Potter. "No," Pomfrey said. "None at all." Fudge pressed. "No legitimate therapeutic protocol involves 68 suppression charms layered over a decade on a non-consenting infant and child," Pomfrey said, and the no in that sentence carried enough force to make 2 members of the Wizengamot's front row sit slightly further back. Dumbledore did not cross-examine her. This was, Harry realized, its own kind of statement. Dumbledore was not going to fight the evidence. He was going to, Harry wasn't sure yet what he was going to do, but it wasn't going to be fight the facts of what had been found. The St. Mungo's healer, her name was Chang, no relation to anyone Harry knew, confirmed the independent diagnostic findings in 15 minutes of very clear technical testimony. She had the manner of someone who was extremely good at her job and found the entire situation professionally outrageous, but kept the outrage locked behind pristine clinical language that was somehow more devastating for its restraint. Then Marchbanks looked up at the gallery and said, "Harry Potter." He walked down the steps from the gallery to the chamber floor and the room tracked him the way a room tracks a person who doesn't know they're the center of attention. But Harry knew, and he didn't mind it. He sat in the chair, and the chains stirred slightly and then went still, not binding him, just registering his presence and finding nothing requiring restraint, which he thought was about right. He looked at Marchbanks. Then, briefly, at Bones. Then he let his gaze move across the Wizengamot in the middle tier, and then, last, at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back at him. Those pale eyes were very steady and very serious and had in them something that wasn't quite, Harry searched for the right word, wasn't quite guilt. It was older than guilt. It was the expression of a man who had made a decision that had cost something and had decided the cost was acceptable and was now, for the first time, sitting in a room where that calculus was being publicly examined and finding that it looked different when other people could see the arithmetic. Harry held the look for 3 seconds and then returned his attention to Marchbanks, because Dumbledore's feelings about being here were not Harry's concern. Bones stood. "Mr. Potter. I'm going to ask you several questions about your experience of your own health and magical development. Please answer as accurately as you can." She paused. "How would you describe your general health prior to last week?" "I was small for my age," Harry said. "I was always told that was just how I was. I had trouble keeping weight on, my cousin's family thought I was a picky eater, but I ate what I was given. I was tired a lot." He paused. "I thought everyone felt that way. And your magical development? Your experience of using magic?" "There was always something in the way," Harry said. "Not obviously, not like a wall, more like the volume was turned down. I'd try something and it would work but it felt like it should be easier than it was." He thought about the Wingardium Leviosa in first class, the reaching feeling, the effort. "Now that it's clearing, I can feel the difference." "The charms are degrading," Bones said, to the chamber generally. "Madame Pomfrey has documented the decline from 68 to 24 over the course of 9 days, attributed to Mr. Potter's magical core pushing against the suppressive array." She returned to Harry. "Have you experienced any changes in your magical ability as the charms decline?" "Yes," he said. "Can you describe them?" He thought about the feather at the ceiling. About the potions class. About the Quidditch practice that had made Wood look as though he'd received a religious experience. "Everything is clearer," he said. "More responsive. Stronger. Things I had to work at don't require the same effort anymore." He paused. "I think I've been at about 30% of what I should be. Maybe less." The chamber was very quiet. Fudge made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. "One more question," Bones said. "You are aware of the magical signature attribution in this case. You've seen the evidential record. Do you have any knowledge, from your own experience or observations, of the accused having access to you during the period in question, specifically the earliest charm placements at age 18 months? Harry considered the question carefully, because Bones had told him not to volunteer and he was going to honor that. "I know that Albus Dumbledore was the one who arranged for me to be placed with my aunt and uncle after my parents died," he said. "I know he made that decision unilaterally and that it was implemented immediately after Voldemort's attack when I was 15 months old." He paused. 18 months falls within the window when I was living at my aunt and uncle's house, under the arrangements Dumbledore made." "No further questions," Bones said. Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore. You may question the witness. Dumbledore looked at Harry. And for a long moment he simply looked. There was something in it that was not performance, Harry thought. Some genuine thing that had no strategic value and was happening anyway. Harry, Dumbledore said, not Mr. Potter, just Harry, and the familiarity of it moved through the chamber like a current. I want to ask you one thing, and I want you to answer it honestly, as I know you will. He paused. In the 5 years since you have been at Hogwarts, 1 year, Bones interjected. Forgive me. In the 3 months since you have been at Hogwarts, have I ever treated you with anything other than care? Harry sat in the chair and looked at the man who had put 68 charms on him before he could walk, and thought about the question with the honesty it apparently warranted. You always seemed kind, Harry said. You always seemed like you had my best interests in mind. He paused. But kind isn't the same as good. And seeming isn't the same as being. Dumbledore was still for a moment. Then he said, no. It isn't. No further questions, Harry said, which was, Marchbanks noted with a dry look, not actually how witness procedure worked but which she allowed anyway because the chamber had gone so quiet that correcting the procedure felt like vandalism. Harry stood and walked back up to the gallery and sat down beside McGonagall, who had her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Dumbledore's address to the chamber was not a defense. This was what Harry hadn't anticipated. He'd been steeling himself for the wizarding world's greatest mind to construct an argument so layered and brilliant that it would create doubt where there was none, the verbal equivalent of the charm architecture itself, obscuring and suppressing and redirecting. He'd been ready for that. What Dumbledore offered instead was an explanation. He stood, Marchbanks hadn't asked him to stand but he stood anyway, and something in the room's posture adjusted in response, because 60 years of Dumbledore commanding attention had trained the room even here, even now, and he spoke for 11 minutes without notes. He spoke about the prophecy. He spoke about Voldemort, not as a defeated enemy but as a defeated enemy who was not yet gone, who was diminished and scattered and dangerous in ways that most of the wizarding world preferred not to contemplate. He spoke about what he believed the prophecy required, a boy who could be guided, who could be prepared, who could meet the final confrontation with the right character and the right humility, who had not been inflated by early exposure to his own extraordinary power. He spoke about power, specifically about what he had read in Harry's magical signature at 15 months, the night he'd carried the boy from Godric's Hollow. He had seen, he said, something that frightened him. Not because it was dark. Because it was immense. And an immense, untrained magical core in a boy who would grow up knowing he was famous and beloved and the subject of prophecy was, in his considered judgment, a catastrophic foundation for the humility that survival required. I made a choice, Dumbledore said. I made it with full knowledge of what I was doing and why. I made it because I believed, and I still believe, that the alternative was worse. He looked at the chamber. I do not ask you to agree with my reasoning. I ask you to understand it. The chamber was very quiet. Then a woman in the third tier, small, sharp-faced, in robes that were slightly too new and pressed slightly too deliberately, said, You acted to protect the wizarding world. I acted to protect Harry, Dumbledore said. And through him, the wizarding world. Yes. Without consent, Bones said, not as a question. He was an infant, Dumbledore said. There was no consent to obtain. There were legal guardianship provisions under which consent could have been sought from an appointed magical guardian, Bones said. There were St. Mungo's oversight procedures. There were, she gestured to the Wizengamot, these people, who exist precisely so that individuals with power do not make unilateral decisions about the welfare of children. She paused. You bypassed every one of those structures. Not because they didn't exist. Because you didn't want to. Dumbledore looked at her. If I had submitted this to committee, he said, not unkindly, the answer would have been no. And the boy would have grown into his power before he understood its cost. And people would have died. You don't know that, Bones said. No, Dumbledore said. I don't. I know only what I believed. And you believed, Bones said, that it was your prerogative to decide. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. I believe that. Something in the chamber shifted. Not dramatically, not outrage or shouting, nothing so simple. But the quality of the attention changed, the way attention changes when something that has been complicated suddenly becomes, in a single sentence, very clear. Harry sat in the gallery and watched Albus Dumbledore admit it and felt something he hadn't expected, not triumph, not relief, something quieter and stranger. He felt like a room that had just had all its furniture moved out, empty in a way that wasn't bad. Spacious. The story he'd lived in was being taken apart piece by piece and the space it left was just space, not ruin. What he built in it was going to be his own. The deliberation took 40 minutes. Harry waited in an anteroom with McGonagall, who had said almost nothing since they'd come off the chamber floor and was dealing with her feelings about that by sitting in very precise alignment with the vertical and apparently auditing her interior life with the same rigor she brought to grading essays. Harry ate a sandwich that one of the Aurors had brought him and thought about what Dumbledore had said about his magical signature at 15 months. Immense. He turned the word over. He'd been working so hard to contextualize, to be rational, to process rather than react, and now in the quiet anteroom with a cheese sandwich in his hand and 40 Wizengamot members deliberating on the other side of a stone wall, he let himself feel the full size of what had been done. 68 charms. A decade. Someone had looked at a 15-month-old child and seen a power that frightened them and had decided the cleanest solution was to simply turn it down. Like a volume knob. Like Harry Potter was a piece of equipment that was outputting too strongly and needed calibration. He finished the sandwich. He was not going to be calibrated. Not now, not going forward, not by anyone. McGonagall spoke without looking up. He was wrong, she said. Not loud. Just very definite. Whatever he feared, whatever he believed, he was wrong. I know, Harry said. His intentions, she stopped. Started again. The road to extraordinary harm is paved with extraordinary intentions. That is a thing I should have, she stopped again. I trusted him for a very long time. I believed that his judgment on certain matters, on large matters, was simply better than mine. And I allowed that belief to stop me from looking. She looked at Harry then, directly. I'm sorry. That's not sufficient. I know it isn't. But I want to say it. Harry looked at her. She was not performing this apology, there was nothing of performance in McGonagall's emotional register, she simply didn't have the architecture for it. This was genuine and it was costing her something and it would have been easy to let her pay the full cost of it. You sent me to Pomfrey, he said. You didn't have to order the scan. It wasn't protocol for a troll incident where the students were standing up and talking. It was good practice, she said. It was you, Harry said. And it mattered. McGonagall looked at him for a moment and then looked away, and the rigidity in her shoulders settled by a single degree, which for her was significant. Don't be more gracious than is warranted, she said. It's very irritating. Sorry, Harry said. No, you're not. No, he agreed. Not really. The anteroom door opened and Bones came in with her case folder under her arm and an expression that was composed and precise and told him everything he needed to know before she said a word. Guilty on all counts, Bones said. 68 charges under Section 7 of the Magical Persons Act and Sections 14 and 22 of the Child Protection Act. The Chamber has voted 61-5 for formal arrest and detention pending sentencing. She looked at Harry steadily. He's been arrested. He'll be held in ministry custody while the sentencing phase is prepared. That'll take several weeks. Harry absorbed this. What happens during that phase? The Chamber considers the full scope of the offense, context, and intent in determining sentencing. His explanation will be heard fully in that process. She paused. It doesn't change the verdict. He did what he did. But it may affect the sentence. That seems right, Harry said. Bones looked at him with that assessing quality she had. You're not celebrating, she said. No, he said. Good, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite respect and was actually both of those things pressed together into a single syllable. Ready to go back in? The chamber wants to formally acknowledge you before proceedings close. Harry stood up and straightened his robes and thought, 24 charms left. 68 minus 44 and counting. And then he thought, I was extraordinary enough that the most powerful man in the wizarding world was afraid of me at 15 months old. He walked back into the chamber. The formal acknowledgement by the Wizengamot was brief. Marchbank said the chamber wished to formally register, for the record, that Harry Potter had been subject to criminal magical harm under the care of the Wizarding State's most trusted institution, and that the chamber accepted responsibility for the systemic failure to protect him and committed to the reparative process. Harry said, thank you, clearly and without elaboration, because he was following Bones's instruction about not filling silences and also because thank you was, for the moment, the truest thing he had. He did not look at the chair in the center of the room. Dumbledore had been taken out through the side door 45 minutes ago and the chair sat empty in the blue torchlight with the chains coiled at its arms, and he had no interest in giving it more attention than it had already received. He walked out of the chamber and into the stone corridor and the elevator and then up through the ministry and into the cold November London air, and McGonagall was beside him and behind her were Bones and the two Aurors and the ordinary business of the street, and he stood for a moment on the pavement and breathed. The hum in his chest was warm and solid. 24 charms. He'd get there. Chapter 5, Aftermath and Ash the Prophet ran it Wednesday morning. Harry found out at breakfast when the owls came in and half the hall received copies of the same front page simultaneously, and the noise that went through the great hall was the kind of noise that a stone makes when you drop it into still water, a single loud impact and then rings spreading outward in every direction, getting quieter and further and not stopping. He was already eating. He'd come down early specifically to be seated and eating and visibly normal before the news arrived, because McGonagall had told him the night before that the Prophet would run it and that his best move was to not be standing in the middle of the hall when the room's reaction hit. She'd been right about the timing. The owls came at 7:42 and he had been on his second piece of toast since 7:15. The headline was not subtle. Dumbledore arrested, 68 suppression charms found on boy who lived, Wizengamot finds chief warlock guilty on all counts below it, taking up the entire upper half of the front page, was the artist's rendering of Dumbledore in the center chair, not a photograph, because the proceedings had been closed to cameras, but a drawing that managed to be both accurate and somehow more devastating than a photograph would have been, because the artist had caught the specific quality of Dumbledore's expression in that chamber, the one that wasn't guilt but was older than guilt. Harry looked at the paper that Seamus Finnegan was holding 2 seats down and went back to his toast. The hall processed the news the way the hall processed things, loudly and all at once, voices coming from every table in overlapping waves, the Gryffindors, the Hufflepuffs, the Ravenclaws, even the Slytherins going uncharacteristically audible. He heard his name several times without really hearing it, the way you stop registering sound that's become background. He kept eating. Hermione arrived at 6 minutes to 8 with her copy of the Prophet already folded to the inner pages, which meant she'd had it for several minutes before coming down and had used the time to read the full piece rather than react to the headline. She sat down across from him and set the paper on the table between them. The reporting is mostly accurate, she said. They've got the charge count right, the verdict right, the custody status right. They've described the charms correctly. She paused. They've also written 3 column inches of speculation about your current power levels that is partly accurate and mostly nonsense. Partly accurate, Harry said. The bit about your magical core reasserting itself is correct. The bit about you being the most powerful wizard of your generation is, she considered it, premature in its specifics but probably not wrong in its general direction. Ron appeared, sat down, picked up the paper, looked at it, set it back down. Are you all right? He asked Harry. Yes, Harry said. Toast? Yeah, ta. Ron took the toast, looked around the hall with a measuring expression. It's loud. It's loud, Harry agreed. Going to get louder, Ron said. My mum's going to write. Probably this afternoon. She was very, Dumbledore was very, he stopped, clearly editing. Our family respected him a lot. It's going to be a lot for her. I know, Harry said. I'm not, this isn't about your family, Ron. I know it isn't. But it's going to feel close. Ron ate the toast. She'll come around. She's not a person who stays wrong when the facts change. Takes her a minute but she gets there. He said this with the confidence of someone who had been being parented by Molly Weasley for 11 years and understood the terrain. Dad'll be fine. He already thought the whole thing sounded wrong when Percy mentioned it at dinner last night. I told them a bit, I hope that's fine, Harry said. It's public record now. At the head table, the teachers were a study in contrasted reactions. Flitwick had the Prophet open and was reading it with the kind of absorbed, rapid attention he gave to things that he found genuinely technically interesting. Sprout was talking to Sinistra in an urgent undertone. Quirrell, Harry noticed, was staring at the paper very still, and the back of his turban was doing something odd, a faint tremor, a slight pressure against the fabric that was there and then not there. Harry watched it for a moment and then looked away. McGonagall was not at the table. She was in her office, because the letter from the Board of Governors had arrived 6 minutes before the Prophet and she'd been dealing with it since. The letter was from Lucius Malfoy, whose son had been in her Transfiguration class for 8 weeks and whose opinion of the Hogwarts administration was roughly equivalent to his opinion of Muggle-born students, which was to say he thought both needed significant management. He wrote in the precise, thin-nibbed hand of someone who had been educated at considerable expense and wanted everyone to know it, and his letter covered 4 points. First, that the Board of Governors needed to convene immediately to address the leadership vacancy. Second, that the interim headship of Hogwarts required board appointment and not ministry imposition. Third, that Mr. Potter's welfare and continued education was the board's concern and he personally would be overseeing the appropriate arrangements. And fourth, most significantly, that given the disruption to the school's stability, Mr. Potter might benefit from removal to a more appropriate environment while the institutional situation settled. McGonagall had read appropriate environment 3 times and each time the phrase had gotten smaller and colder and more precise in her understanding of what it meant, and what it meant was, someone with power and interests in the outcome should have custody of Harry Potter during the vacuum left by Dumbledore's arrest. She sent her reply in 15 minutes, which was faster than she usually composed correspondence because she had very little to think about. The interim headship of Hogwarts defaults to the deputy headmistress under the school's governing charter, Section 3, Clause 9. I am the deputy headmistress. Harry Potter is a student in my care and under the independent guardianship I filed with the DMLE on Friday. He will remain at Hogwarts. He is not a chess piece. M. McGonagall, acting headmistress. She sealed it, sent it, and then sat for a moment with the fire crackling and the office around her that was not yet reorganized and was still unmistakably Dumbledore's, with his portraits of former headmasters and the various silver instruments and the pensieve under its cloth and Fawkes's perch, empty because Fawkes had left when his wizard had been taken into custody and no one knew where he'd gone. The perch bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She'd worked in this building for 30 years with the distant warmth of that phoenix somewhere above and now the perch was a bare wooden stand and the room felt different because of it. She put the feeling aside and went back to work. The day at Hogwarts was not normal, but it was managed. Classes ran. Harry attended them. The corridors between classes were gauntlet-like. Every student he passed had a reaction to him that registered somewhere on the spectrum between stricken concern and wide-eyed awe, and he moved through it all with the even-keeled steadiness that had become his default mode over the last 9 days and that he suspected was going to be tested considerably harder before things settled. In Transfiguration, a Ravenclaw girl named Turpin asked him how he was doing in the sincere, slightly theatrical way of someone who had been very moved by the Prophet article and wanted to express that she had been very moved. Harry told her he was fine and thanked her and managed to say both without it sounding like he wanted the conversation to end. even though he did. In History of Magic, Binns didn't notice anything had happened because Binns was, as always, somewhere in the 14th century and had no particular interest in current events regardless of their magnitude. In defense against the dark arts, Quirrell cancelled the lesson without explanation, which nobody minded but which Harry filed in the same place he'd filed the thing with the turban at breakfast, not urgently, but present. Between defense and lunch, walking alone for a few minutes because he'd told Ron and Hermione he wanted 5 minutes of quiet, he went to the second-floor window where he'd stood after dinner last week and put his hand against the glass and felt the castle. It was clearer than it had been. The reach of his awareness had expanded since Tuesday. He could feel the full extent of the inhabited floors without effort, a warm map of presences and magical signatures that updated as people moved. He could feel which classrooms were occupied, the particular signatures of the teachers, the hundreds of student corps each with their own flavor of magic like different instruments in a very large orchestra. He could feel something else too. Something at the top of the castle, in the 7th-floor corridor, that was very faint and very old and shaped like a door that wasn't a door, and something in the dungeons that pulsed with the slow, deep rhythm of something old and contained. He didn't know what either of those things were yet. He filed them too. He took his hand off the glass and went to lunch. The letters came in the afternoon post, not owls from home, but from outside. From strangers. Pomfrey intercepted them. She had, apparently, anticipated this and had coordinated with the Ollery keeper so that any post addressed to Harry Potter that arrived after the Prophet story would come to the hospital wing first for her review, and she presented him with a summary after his evening scan rather than the letters themselves. 112 letters, she said. I've sorted them into 4 categories. She held up a hand to forestall the objection he hadn't made yet. You're welcome to read any or all of them. I'm not preventing you. I'm making it possible for you to understand what you're receiving before you receive it. He considered this. What are the 4 categories? Support and well-wishing, 73 letters. Those are genuine and most of them are from ordinary people who are upset on your behalf. She set a stack on the bedside table. The second category is press requests, 14 letters from various publications requesting interviews or statements. Those go in the bin unless you want to talk to someone. She put a second, smaller stack next to the first. Third category is political correspondence, 9 letters from various members of the Wizengamot, Board of Governors, or ministry officials. Most of them are inappropriate to send to an 11-year-old and suggest whoever sent them is either oblivious or deliberately trying to involve you in things you shouldn't be involved in without legal counsel. She paused. Those go to Madame Bones. And the 4th? Harry asked. Pomfrey set a single letter on the bedside table. It was sealed with red wax and the writing on the front was an elderly, cramped hand that shook slightly on the long letters but was precise on the short ones. This one is from Elphias Doge, Pomfrey said. He was one of Dumbledore's oldest friends. He asks that you read it and says it contains no attempt to change your position or influence the proceedings, only something he thinks you deserve to know. Harry looked at the single letter for a moment. I'll read the support ones tonight, he said. And that one. He paused. Burn the press requests. Gladly, Pomfrey said. The scan showed 19 charms remaining. He was at the steepest part of the degradation curve now. Each remaining charm was holding on with less and less support from the collapsed outer layers, like a building whose walls had been removed floor by floor until only the foundation stones remained. How long? He asked. Pomfrey ran the secondary analysis. For days, she said. Perhaps 5. When the last one goes, you'll feel it. She paused. I want you here in the ward when it happens. Not because it'll be dangerous, but because I want to be present. All right, he said. She looked at him with the look she'd been developing over the last week, the one that had warmth in it that he suspected she kept fairly private generally. You're sleeping. Better than I ever have, he said. Good. Eat more at dinner. She handed him the potion bottle. The amber one supports the physical transition. The blue one supports magical stabilization. Don't mix them up. I know, he said. I haven't mixed them up yet. You've also never had 11 days of accelerating magical and physical development before, she said. I'm telling you again. Don't mix them up. He drank the amber one then and there to demonstrate that he knew which was which, and she made the face of someone who has been outmaneuvered by an 11-year-old and finds it almost entirely acceptable. Doja's letter was short. Dear Mr. Potter, I am Elphia's Doge. Albus was my friend for more than 70 years, and I write this knowing that whatever feelings I have about recent events, they are irrelevant compared to what you have experienced. I will not ask you to think charitably of him. I write only to tell you one thing that I believe you deserve to know. When Albus took you from Godric's Hollow on the night of November the 1st, he held you for 4 hours before he gave you to Hagrid to deliver. 4 hours, in the ruins of the house, in the cold, while the ministry people came and went around him. I know this because I was there. I have thought often about what that meant. I still don't know. But I believe you should have it. Doge. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of the bedside table and lay back and looked at the ceiling and let the information settle into him the way you let something settle when you're not going to act on it immediately but you don't want to lose it either. 4 hours. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He wasn't sure it changed anything. He wasn't sure it was supposed to. He thought maybe Doge had sent it for exactly this reason, not to exonerate, not to explain, just to add a piece to the picture that the picture didn't have yet and that Harry had the right to. He filed it. Next to the turban, next to the 7th floor corridor, next to the foundation stones of the castle. He'd come back to it. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor to Hogwarts. Who is it? Harry said. McGonagall paused. Arthur Weasley, she said, and looked at Ron, and a representative from the Department of Magical Creatures. It's about the guardianship. The formal magical guardianship, not the court proceedings one. She folded her hands. The question of who has legal guardianship of you now that the arrangements Dumbledore made are being reviewed it's come to a head faster than I anticipated. Ron went still in a way that Harry recognized as Ron absorbing something large. Dad's here about guardianship, he said. In a representative capacity, McGonagall said carefully. He's here as a ministry representative, he's not making a personal application. He's here to present options. Harry looked at Ron, who was doing something complicated with his expression. Are you all right? Harry asked. Ron said. Yeah. Come on. He pushed back his chair, because apparently they were all three going, which McGonagall had clearly anticipated and made no move to prevent. Arthur Weasley was in the small meeting room off the main entrance, the one used for parent meetings that wasn't formal enough for the headmistress's office. He stood up when Harry came in and he had the look of a man who had been thinking carefully about what to say and was now setting the prepared version aside because the reality was different from what he'd been preparing for. He was tall, red-haired, with the same kind eyes that Ron had, and he looked at Harry with a directness that had nothing performed about it. Harry, he said. Sit down, please. All of you. He looked at Ron. Hello, son. Dad, Ron said, and sat beside Harry. Pomfrey arrived a minute later and took the chair near the door with the posture of someone who has positioned themselves to observe everything and intervene if necessary but has every intention of letting the scene proceed. Arthur opened his folder. Right. I'll be direct, because I think you deserve directness. He looked at Harry. The Dursley guardianship, the Muggle placement Dumbledore arranged, is being reviewed by both the DMLE and the Wizengamot's Welfare Committee as part of the broader case. The arrangement may be invalidated. If it is, you'll need a magical guardian, a formal one, not just a proceedings guardian. He paused. I want to be very clear, I'm here as a ministry representative first. There are several options available. I'll walk you through them. What are they? Harry said. First option, Hogwarts takes formal guardianship until you reach majority. That means the school acts in loco parentis, which is McGonagall in practical terms. Second option, a ministry-appointed guardian, usually a Wizengamot member or senior ministry official. Third option, he paused and the professional tone shifted slightly, just by a degree, a private family application. From a family with a pre-existing relationship to you. The room was quiet. Is your family making that application? Harry asked. Arthur looked at his folder and then at Harry. Molly wants to, he said, and the precision of Molly wants to over we want to told Harry something about the conversation that had happened at the Burrow last night. She read the prophet and she, you know Molly. She wants to feed you up and take you home and she is extremely upset on your behalf. He paused. I think she'd be good at it. I'd try to be as well. He glanced at Ron. And it would make this one very happy, though he won't say so. Dad, Ron said. I'm not going to pretend the personal isn't there, Arthur said, with the calm of a man who believed in being honest about complicated things. But I want to be equally clear, this is entirely your decision. You have been having decisions made for you your entire life. That is not going to happen today, not by me, not about this. If you want the school guardianship, that is the right decision. If you want a Wizengamot appointment, that is the right decision. If you want something else entirely. He closed his folder. You tell us what you want and we'll make it work. Harry sat in the small meeting room with the autumn light coming through the single window and McGonagall beside him and Pomfrey near the door and Ron trying very hard to look like he wasn't hoping for anything in particular, and he thought about the question properly. He thought about the Burrow, which he'd heard Ron describe in enough detail to have a clear picture, the crooked building that defied physics, the garden with its gnomes, the kitchen that smelled like something good at all hours, the chaotic warmth of it. He thought about Molly Weasley, whom he'd met for 30 minutes at King's Cross and who had counted him into her head count and touched his hair and said you're very welcome, dear, with such uncomplicated warmth that it had stayed with him for 2 months. He thought about what Pomfrey had said about 4 days until the last charm was gone. He thought, I need to be somewhere safe when that happens. Safe and known and real. I'd like the Weasley application, he said. If it's offered genuinely. It is, Arthur said quietly. And I'd like to finish the term at Hogwarts, Harry added. Not leave now. The removal thing, Malfoy's letter, McGonagall said, with a precision that suggested she knew exactly where he'd gotten that from. Whoever wrote it, Harry said, I don't want to be moved. Not now. Not while everything is still, I want to see it through from here. Absolutely, Arthur said. He was writing something in his folder. The application will be formal by Monday. In the meantime, Hogwarts guardianship stands. He looked at McGonagall. Agreed? Agreed, McGonagall said. Ron was doing something with his face that was quite a lot of something, and eventually he gave up doing it quietly and ran one hand over his forehead and said, right, in a voice that was very slightly not steady, and Harry looked at him and they both looked at the window for a moment. You're my brother already, Harry said, in the way that matters. This is just paperwork. Ron made a sound that was probably going to be identified later as a laugh. Shut up, he said. Right, Harry agreed. Friday brought the first serious pushback. It came in 2 forms, one anticipated, one not. The anticipated form was the Dumbledore loyalists, who had been gathering voice since Wednesday and by Friday had organized enough to produce a counter-narrative in the Prophet's Letters section that occupied the full page and bled onto the next. The letters ranged from measured to unhinged, but their collective argument was a version of the one Dumbledore himself had made in the chamber. He had acted out of necessity, out of foresight, out of a care for the greater good that small minds couldn't compass. Several of the letters questioned Harry's own account. Several more questioned Pomfrey's methodology. One, from an anonymous sender, suggested that the whole thing was a ministry plot to remove the most powerful defender the wizarding world had. Harry read through them in the common room Friday evening with Ron and Hermione, and he read them the way you read things you need to understand rather than things you need to respond to. The loyalist position was not incomprehensible, that was the thing that mattered, the thing that he didn't want to oversimplify. These were not stupid people. These were people who had organized their moral universe around Albus Dumbledore for decades, who had seen him stand against Grindelwald and against Voldemort and against a dozen lesser evils, who had trusted him with the deep, personal, identity-level trust that you give to the figures who shaped your understanding of what safety means. Asking them to revise that overnight was not a small thing. "They're not wrong that he's done genuine good," Harry said, setting the prophet down. Hermione looked up from her own copy. "No," she agreed. "He has. So have plenty of people who've also done genuine harm," Ron said, with the blunt pragmatism of someone who had spent a lot of Friday thinking about this. "Being good on some things doesn't make the other things not happen. My mum made that point actually." He paused. "She cried a bit when she found out. But then she made that point." "Molly Weasley is sensible," Harry said. "Don't tell her I said so, she'll be insufferable about it." The unanticipated form of pushback was Draco Malfoy. Not the usual Malfoy, not the sneering corridor variety who made comments about Harry's fame and blood status and found creative ways to be unpleasant within the technical limits of school rules. This was Malfoy at 8 in the evening, appearing in the Gryffindor common room through the portrait hole, which was a thing that could only happen if a Gryffindor let you in, and the Gryffindor who'd let him in was apparently Percy Weasley, who'd been returning from prefect duty and had been told it was urgent and had made a questionable decision about definitions of urgent. Malfoy stood in the entrance to the Gryffindor common room, which was full of people who were all looking at him with the varied expressions of people who have encountered something unexpected and offensive in a space they considered secure, and he looked at Harry with an expression that was not his usual expression. "I need to talk to you," Malfoy said. "In our common room," Harry said. "I know. I'm aware of how this looks. Do you? Can you just?" Malfoy stopped. Started again with the clipped precision of someone who had rehearsed the version without the feeling and was finding the feeling keeps getting in the way. "My father wrote to the board. About you. About moving you somewhere, manageable." "I know," Harry said. "I'm not." Another stop. Malfoy was, Harry realized, 17 different kinds of uncomfortable and was pushing through it with what was either courage or desperation, which sometimes looked the same. "I'm not here because I think what happened to you was all right. I'm here because my father is going to push harder and you should know it's coming." The common room was very quiet for an 11-year-old's dormitory common room at 8 in the evening. Harry looked at Malfoy for a moment, reading the specific flavor of the discomfort, not guilt, not sympathy exactly, something more complicated. The particular conflict of a boy who had been raised to worship the ideology his father served and was standing in his enemy's common room because something about that ideology had rubbed up hard against something else he couldn't name. "Why are you telling me?" Harry said. "Because whatever you are," Malfoy said, and then he did something Harry didn't expect, which was to leave the sentence unfinished. Not in a rhetorical way. In the way of someone who genuinely doesn't have the rest of it yet. "Just, watch yourself." He turned and went back through the portrait hole before anyone could say anything else, and left an extremely loaded silence behind him. Ron stared at the portrait hole. "Did Draco Malfoy just warn you?" "Apparently," Harry said. "That's deeply unsettling." "I thought it was interesting," Hermione said. "You think everything is interesting," Ron said. "That's because most things are," she said, and went back to her book, but Harry could see the small focused frown that meant she was thinking hard about something and planned to think about it for a while. Harry sat back and felt the hum in his chest and thought about what Malfoy had left unfinished. "Whatever you are." He was 4 days away from finding out. Saturday morning delivered the letter from Azkaban. It came via a ministry owl, grey and official-looking, and it was addressed in handwriting that was unsteady but deliberate, the handwriting of someone whose hands weren't quite their own anymore but who was making them do the work anyway. It was from Sirius Black. Harry stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it, because the name on the back, S. Black, Azkaban, was a name he knew, a name that occupied a particular place in the thin collection of facts he had about his own history. His parents' secret keeper. The man who had betrayed them. In Azkaban since before Harry could remember, serving a life sentence. He opened it anyway. Harry, I know you don't know me. I know what you've been told about me. I also know that you've just experienced what it feels like when the information you were given about someone turns out to be shaped by people with reasons to shape it, so I ask only that you read this and decide for yourself. I am your godfather. I did not betray your parents. I have been trying to get a message to someone with the influence to hear this for 10 years, and the thing that has happened this week, the hearing, the record, the crack in the wall, has created the first possibility I've had of being heard. I don't ask you to believe me. I ask you to ask Madame Bones to look at the case. Just look at it. She will know what to look for. Serious. Harry read it twice. Then he read it a third time, very carefully, the way you read something when you're trying to feel for the shape of the truth inside it rather than just the surface of the words. He thought about she will know what to look for. He thought about Bones, the precision of her, the rigor of her, the way she'd asked questions aimed at load-bearing points. He thought about what just look at it meant coming from someone who'd had 10 years to work out exactly what needed to be looked at. He thought about what it felt like to have the information you'd been given turn out to be shaped. He folded the letter, put it in his pocket, and went to find Pomfrey. She read it standing at her office desk, and when she'd finished she set it down with the careful deliberation of someone who is deciding whether this is something she is standing to act on or whether it needs to go further up. He's right that Bones would know what to look for, she said slowly. There were questions about that case at the time that were never fully answered. The trial, specifically. She paused. Or rather the lack of one. He didn't get a trial. Harry said. Pomfrey looked at him over the letter. No, she said. He didn't. Harry let that sit for a moment. The hum in his chest was very steady. Send it to Bones, he said. Please. I will, Pomfrey said. She looked at him. Harry, I know it might be nothing, he said. I know he might be what everyone says he is. He paused. But I know what it's like to have everyone say a thing about you that isn't true. And I'm not going to let that be the reason I don't look. Pomfrey looked at him for a moment, and then she did something she'd done once before. She sat down on the edge of the bed across from him and simply looked at him with the full weight of 23 years of caring for children, with the professional distance entirely absent, with just the person underneath it. Your parents would have been proud of you, she said. I know that's a thing people say. I mean it specifically, not generally. James would have been delighted by you. Lily would have recognized herself in you completely. She picked up the letter. And I think she would have said exactly what you just said. Harry was quiet for a moment. Something in his chest that was separate from the hum, more personal, more raw, shifted and ached and settled. Thank you, he said, and meant it the way he'd meant it in the Wizengamot, precisely, genuinely, without wrapper. Go on, she said. You'll be late for breakfast. He went. Behind him, he heard her already composing the owl for Bones, the scratch of her quill decisive and quick, building another brick in the wall of a story that was not finished yet, not nearly. 19 charms. 4 days. Somewhere in Azkaban, a man who shared his blood and his history was waiting for someone to look. Harry walked through the castle and felt it breathing around him and thought, I'm looking. Chapter 6, What Remains. The last charm went on a Tuesday. Exactly 2 weeks to the day after Pomfrey had first run the scan, Harry woke at 3 in the morning and lay very still in the dark and knew that something had changed in the last few hours, the way you know when weather has broken, not through observation but through the quality of the air, the feeling of pressure released, the specific silence that follows something that has been making noise for so long you'd stopped registering it as noise. He pressed his hand to his chest. The hum was gone. In its place was something that the word hum didn't come close to covering. Something full and present and vast in the way that the sky is vast, not threatening, not overwhelming, just genuinely and completely without the ceiling that had always been there before. He breathed in and out 3 times very slowly and felt himself differently, the way you feel yourself differently after an illness breaks and you realize the heaviness you'd been carrying had a name and the name is gone now. He got up quietly, put his glasses on, pulled on his robes, and went to the hospital wing. Pomfrey was already awake. She was sitting at her desk with a cup of tea and the evidential record open before her, as though she'd been waiting, and when he came through the door she looked up and looked at him and set down her cup. "Sit down," she said. He sat on the nearest bed. She came with the diagnostic wand and ran the full scan, the long one, the comprehensive one, and the light that came off it was white. Clean, flat, unambiguous white. The rune display that appeared above his chest showed no suppression signatures, no layering remnants, no calcification traces. Just Harry Potter's magical core reading in the clear for the first time since he was 18 months old. Pomfrey read the runes for a long time without speaking. "Well?" Harry said. She looked at him over the diagnostic display. "Your magical core output is registering at a level I need to recalibrate my instrument to accurately measure," she said. "The calibration scale I use goes to 35 on the standard magical output index. You're reading above that." Harry looked at the white light hovering above him. "How far above?" "I'll need specialist instruments to tell you precisely." She cancelled the display with a careful flick. "What I can tell you is that the baseline reading, the ambient magical output of your core at complete rest, doing nothing at all, is higher than any score I've recorded on this wand in 23 years. She paused. "Including the scores of several 7th years I examined after their newts, which tends to be when magical output peaks in young people." Harry let this sit for a moment. He wasn't alarmed by it. He wasn't giddy. He was something in between that didn't have a clean name, something like recognition. Like meeting your own face in a mirror after a long time looking at photographs. "Does it feel different?" Pomfrey asked. "Yes," he said. And then, because she deserved something more precise than that, "everything feels like flying." She looked at him for a moment and then she nodded once, and he thought the corner of her mouth moved in the particular way it moved when she was feeling something she wasn't going to name out loud. "Go back to bed," she said. "We'll do a full assessment in the morning. Something to eat first, your body just completed a significant physical and magical transition." She produced a plate from somewhere with toast and a small pot of honey and he ate it sitting on the hospital bed at 3:15 in the morning while she wrote up her notes, and it was one of the oddest and most completely peaceful moments of his life. The morning assessment drew a small crowd. Not intentionally, Pomfrey had booked the hospital wing for 2 hours and asked for privacy and had gotten privacy in the sense that no one official intruded. But Hermione and Ron appeared at 8 o'clock with the synchronized casualness of 2 people who had independently decided to be somewhere and had not coordinated about it, and McGonagall arrived at 8:15 with her arms folded and her expression that of someone who had a full schedule and had chosen to rearrange it, and nobody sent anyone away. The specialist instruments Pomfrey had sent for overnight, a calibrated thaumatrometer from St. Mungo's, the kind used in core assessment for advanced magical study, arrived by urgent owl at 8:20 and the healer who operated it, the same Chong from the Wizengamot hearing, was with it. Harry sat in the center of the ward. Chong ran the assessment. It took 35 minutes and involved several instruments, several rounds of active magical output tests that Harry performed without particular effort, lumos that filled the ward with noon-level brightness, a Wingardium Leviosa that raised the hospital bed 6 feet and held it with the casual steadiness of long practice. A charm sequence that McGonagall watched with an expression of absolute professional fascination fighting through her composure, and at the end of it Chong compiled her results and handed them to Pomfrey and Pomfrey read them and handed them to McGonagall. McGonagall read them very carefully. She handed the parchment back to Pomfrey and looked at Harry and said, in the precise measured tone of a woman who has decided that understatement is the only appropriate response to the magnitude of what she is saying, "You are going to need substantially more advanced instruction than the current first-year curriculum provides." "I suspected," Harry said. "The reading is extraordinary," Chong said, in the tone of a healer who finds things medically extraordinary with some regularity but is revising her scale today. The core strength indices are, in all my professional experience I have not seen numbers like these from a student of any year. The precision metrics are unusual for someone untrained, normally raw power at this level comes with significant control deficits. Your control indices are disproportionately high. She looked at him. The diagnostic suggests that the suppression charms may have forced your magical core to develop precision in lieu of output, it couldn't go outward so it went inward. In terms of fine control architecture you are reading more like a fully trained adult than an 11-year-old first year. The ward was quiet for a moment. Ron said, "That's dead useful, actually." Hermione looked at him. "Yes," she said, with the slight surprise of someone who had been about to say exactly that. Harry felt the magic in him moving at its full breadth, unhurried and warm and immense, and thought about the decade it had spent developing precision in a cage and thought that some things worked out in unexpected directions. Not an excuse for what had been done. Not a silver lining in the cheap, dismissive sense. Just a true thing, that the attempt to diminish him had, in one specific and ironic way, made him considerably more dangerous. "Right," he said. "What do we do with that?" McGonagall took the parchment back from Pomfrey. "We design you a curriculum," she said, and the briskness of it was the briskness of someone who has found solid ground and is moving. Advanced instruction in each subject, independent study supervised by the relevant teachers. I'll speak to Flitwick today and Sprout and the others. We'll have something in place by next week. She paused. Dumbledore's sentencing is Thursday. You should know that. I know, Harry said. You won't be required to attend. I know, he said again. I'm not going. She looked at him carefully. No. There's nothing I need to hear, he said. Whatever the sentence is, it's the Wizengamot's business and Bones's business. I've said what I had to say. I'm done with that part. He paused. I'd rather be in lessons. McGonagall looked at him for a moment with something that was not quite the professionally managed version of her feelings and was the real thing, briefly visible. Yes, she said. All right. The sentencing was Thursday. Harry was in charms. He found out the result the way he found out most things. Hermione, who had sent a discreet owl to Bones's office requesting notification, received a reply at dinner. She slid it across the table to him without comment and he read it. 5 years in Azkaban, suspended to 3 years under magical monitoring, conditional on full cooperation with the Wizengamot's ongoing review of related decisions including guardianship placements, Order of Merlin status under review, permanent removal from positions of authority including Chief Warlock and Hogwarts Headmaster. A. Bones. Harry read it once and folded it and put it in his pocket. Ron watched him. How do you feel? I don't know yet, Harry said honestly. Ask me in a week. He ate his dinner. Across the hall, the Slytherin table had the particular quality of a group of people who had received news and were processing it carefully and quietly, which was unusual enough that Harry noted it. Malfoy was at the far end, not eating much, turned slightly away from the people on either side of him. Harry watched him for a moment and then looked away. 3 years, suspended. An Order of Merlin under review. A man who had defined the wizarding world for 60 years now under monitoring, stripped of authority, waiting. Harry thought about 4 hours in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, in the cold. He thought about 18 months and 68 charms and a decade of fog. He thought that justice and satisfaction were two different things, and that he'd gotten justice, and that satisfaction was something he was going to have to build himself out of different materials entirely. He thought he was probably up to it. Sirius Black's case reopened on a Friday morning 3 weeks after the sentencing. Bones had been thorough, Harry had known she would be, because thorough was the only register Bones seemed to operate in. What she had found, once she looked, was a case that had the architectural signatures of something built in a hurry, no trial record because there had been no trial, a confession extracted in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic magical explosion that had killed 12 Muggles and Peter Pettigrew, signed by a man in severe shock who had not been provided with counsel and had not been of sound mind. She had also found, buried in the case file that had been sitting untouched for 10 years, a piece of evidence that Sirius Black had apparently screamed about in the immediate aftermath of his arrest and that no one had followed up on, a copy of the Secret Keeper ceremony record from Godric's Hollow, signed by the Potters, transferring Secret Keeper status from Sirius Black to Peter Pettigrew 3 days before Voldemort's attack. The record had been filed and forgotten. Possibly deliberately. Bones did not speculate publicly about the possibly deliberately, but she noted the filing date and the name of the official who had received it and added both to the case file with the quiet efficiency of a woman who collects facts the way other people collect grudges, patiently, without waste, for use when the time is right. The emergency Wizengamot hearing took 4 hours. Harry was not there. He was at Quidditch practice, which Wood had rescheduled twice because of everything and was now treating as a matter of foundational personal integrity to actually conduct. Harry flew in the sharp December air over the Hogwarts pitch with the full reach of his magic and the full capacity of his body and the cold wind coming off the mountains, and he was aware, distantly, that somewhere under the Ministry of Magic's level 10 a chamber was deciding the fate of his godfather. He caught the snitch 14 times. Wood stopped counting after 8. McGonagall was waiting at the pitch entrance when he landed, and she had a piece of parchment in her hand and the expression of a woman who has just delivered news she has been waiting to deliver. "Well?" Harry said. "Sirius Black has been cleared of all charges," she said. "Full exoneration. Immediate release." She paused. "He's being processed out of Azkaban this afternoon." Harry stood on the frosty pitch in his Quidditch robes with his broom in his hand and the snitch still closed in his other fist, and he let this arrive. His godfather. Innocent. 10 years in Azkaban for a crime built on the same architecture as everything else in his life, someone else's decision, someone else's certainty about what was necessary, the quiet engineering of circumstances by people who believed they knew best. "When can I meet him?" Harry said. "Bones is handling the release process," McGonagall said. "She's asked for 48 hours for medical assessment and documentation. After that," she paused, "it's up to him and you." "Right," Harry said. He opened his hand and let the snitch go. It hovered for a moment, wings beating, golden in the December light, and then it shot upward and was gone into the grey sky. "Right," he said again, and went inside. Sirius Black came to Hogwarts on a Sunday. Harry was in the entrance hall when the great doors opened and McGonagall brought him in, and his first thought was that Sirius looked like someone who had been taken apart and put back together by people who'd never seen the original and were working from a description. He was tall, would have been very tall without the slight stoop that came from somewhere inside the posture rather than from the spine. Dark hair falling past his jaw, not trimmed, not managed. Cheekbones that were too prominent in the way that a decade of Azkaban food and Dementor proximity made cheekbones prominent. Grey eyes that were sharp and present and hungry and the opposite of defeated. He stopped when he saw Harry and went very still. Harry looked at him. He looked like his mother. Harry knew this from the single photograph he had, the wedding photograph where Lily laughed and James turned to look at her, and there at the edge of the frame Sirius was grinning at something off camera with the whole body grin of someone who had never learned to contain delight. The man in the entrance hall had the same bone structure and none of the grin yet and all of the potential for it. "You look like James," Sirius said. His voice was rougher than Harry had imagined it. "And like Lily, round the eyes." "I've been told," Harry said. Sirius laughed. It came out slightly broken, slightly surprised, like a door opening that hadn't been opened in a long time and wasn't sure the hinges would hold. But it was genuine. Entirely genuine. "Yeah," he said. "You would have been." He looked at Harry with those grey eyes doing something complicated and careful. "I've got about 11 years of Godfather to catch up on." "I know," Harry said. "I'm not going to be good at it immediately." "I know that too." "I might be," Sirius paused, searching for the right word, and found, "a lot." "I can handle a lot," Harry said. Something moved through Sirius's face, all at once, everything he'd been holding in careful control since he'd walked through the door. His jaw worked. His eyes went bright and he pressed his mouth flat and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of someone fighting a losing battle against themselves, and then he looked at Harry again and the battle was lost and the grin arrived. Not the contained version. The whole body version. The one from the photograph. Yeah, Sirius said. I think you probably can. McGonagall, standing 2 feet away, was looking at the stained glass above the doors with great professional interest. Harry took a step forward, and Sirius took a step forward, and the meeting in the entrance hall of Hogwarts between Harry Potter and his godfather was ungraceful and genuine and involved Sirius's hand landing on the back of Harry's head in a grip that was too tight and was not an accident, and Harry pressing his forehead briefly against Sirius's shoulder in a gesture he would have been incapable of describing, but that felt like the word anchor if anchor were a physical action and not a noun. They stood like that for about 4 seconds. Then McGonagall said, "There's tea in my office. And biscuits, because I anticipated this was going to require biscuits." Sirius pulled back and looked at her, and something in his expression was the look of a man encountering something he'd thought he'd never see again, the specific familiar texture of someone who drove you mad and was fundamentally on your side and never needed to be told to put the kettle on. "Minnie," he said. "Don't," she said, and walked toward her office, and they followed her, and the entrance hall was empty again and the stained glass threw color across the stone floor in the December morning light. The tea lasted 3 hours. Sirius talked. Not in the linear, ordered way of someone giving testimony, the way he'd been talking for 10 years in his own head, which was circular and interrupted and alive in every direction at once. He talked about James and Lily with a fluency that came from a decade of keeping them precise in memory against the Dementor's efforts to gray everything out. He talked about the secret keeper switch. James thought it was clever, bloody James and his clever ideas. Lily had reservations and she was right, she was almost always right when she had reservations, with the particular quality of someone who has lived inside a decision's consequences for 10 years and knows its shape in the dark. He asked about Harry. Not about the charms, not about the hearing, not the public version. He asked about Harry the person, Harry the student, Harry the specifics, with the focused attention of someone doing inventory on a decade's worth of missed material. Harry answered. Honestly, completely, without managing what he gave or what it revealed, because Sirius was, and he understood this in his bones before he fully understood it intellectually, the first person in his life who had a claim on the complete unedited version of him. Not Hermione, not Ron, not McGonagall, not Pomfrey, all of whom he trusted absolutely, all of whom were essential. Sirius was different. Sirius was the one James and Lily had chosen, before Harry existed, to be the person who stood between him and the world if they couldn't. He told him about flying. About the hum in his chest through those 2 weeks. About the potions class and Flitwick's feather and the Quidditch practice that had made Wood look like a man receiving a vision. Sirius listened to all of it with his elbows on McGonagall's desk and his grey eyes entirely present, and occasionally interjected with commentary that was so specifically James-flavored that Harry found it catching in his chest in a way that was painful and good at the same time. James would have lost his mind at the Quidditch, Sirius said. Completely lost it. He was good, he was very good, but what you're describing is a different category entirely. He paused. He would have been so proud. Harry was quiet for a moment. What were they like? Together, every day, not the stories. Sirius looked at him. Something shifted in his eyes, something that had been waiting behind the inventory and the careful precision of preserved memory. Chaotic, he said. Genuinely chaotic. James was always doing 5 things, always with a plan that required about 40% more time than he'd allocated. Lily was the one who knew exactly how long everything actually took and was perpetually exasperated about it, and was also the reason any of it actually got done. He paused. They argued about small things constantly and agreed on large things completely. They were very certain about each other. From quite early on. Not in a soft way, in a concrete way. Like they'd done the maths and reached the answer and weren't going to revisit the working. Harry held that, turned it over, kept it. They were very certain about you, Sirius said. Even before you were, even while Lily was pregnant, there was a quality to it. James walked around for 9 months like someone had handed him the world in a box and he was trying to figure out if he was allowed to keep it. He smiled, and the smile had grief in it and warmth in it, and they weren't fighting each other, they were just both there. He was allowed to keep it. Just not for long enough. The room was quiet. McGonagall was looking at her tea. "I'm sorry," Sirius said. No, Harry said. "Don't. That's exactly what I wanted to know." Sirius looked at him. Yeah. December moved through its remaining weeks with a different quality to it than November had, less siege-like, less the breathless tension of something about to break, more the quality of aftermath, of ground being walked on that had recently been difficult ground and was slowly, genuinely settling. Harry's curriculum expanded. Flitwick introduced him to third-year material with the barely contained enthusiasm of a man who had been given an extraordinary instrument and was discovering its full range. Sprout gave him independent projects in herbology that ran to fifth-year complexity and watched him work with a warm attention that never tipped into pressure. Snape remained Snape, but Harry's potions work was now consistently extraordinary in a way that Snape's only acknowledgement was to stop deducting points for breathing and to occasionally, when he thought Harry wasn't watching, read the results of his cauldron with the tight, reluctant expression of someone encountering quality they'd prefer not to admit to. Quirrell resigned on a Wednesday, citing ill health. The resignation happened quickly and quietly, and the DMLE announced a week later that there was an ongoing investigation into his activities during the term, the nature of which they declined to specify. Harry noted the announcement and noted that the investigation concerned the third-floor corridor and a certain large three-headed dog named Fluffy, and noted also that whatever had been living in the back of Quirrell's turban had not been present in the castle since Quirrell's departure, and filed all of it with the collected knowledge of someone who understood that not all stories had resolved yet and that resolution was a process, not an event. He wrote to Sirius every other day. Sirius wrote back with letters that were long and tangential and funny and honest and occasionally included entirely unsolicited commentary on whatever Harry had told him about his week, usually from the perspective of what James would have said about it, which was, Harry had discovered, an inexhaustible and completely invaluable resource. Sirius was living with a healer who had been assigned by the Wizengamot to oversee his transition out of Azkaban, a quiet woman who apparently made extremely good soup and had infinite patience with the nonlinear process of recovery from Dementor exposure. Sirius described her in his letters with a mix of gratitude and mild exasperation that Harry suspected meant he liked her enormously. The Weasley guardianship was formalized on the 15th of December, 3 days before the Christmas break, in a brief ministry ceremony that Arthur attended with Molly and all of the Weasley children who were at Hogwarts. Molly cried, which she had apparently forewarned everyone would happen, and Percy was dignified about it, and the twins produced from somewhere a small banner that said "Welcome to the family," Harry in gold letters that exploded into sparks when he looked at them, and Ron stood beside him with the expression of someone who has wanted something very much for a long time and is still adjusting to having it. McGonagall witnessed the signing. Pomfrey was there too, which was not officially required but which no one questioned. Harry signed the papers with his steady, deliberate hand, and the magic of the guardianship settled around him like something that had always known where it belonged. Christmas Eve at the Burrow. The kitchen smelled like something extraordinary and complex that had been going all day, and there were fairy lights on every conceivable surface, and Celestina Warbeck was on the wireless at a volume that Molly considered appropriate and everyone else was negotiating quietly with. And the fire was enormous and the snow outside was deep and the twins had done something to the garden gnomes that Harry didn't fully understand but that seemed to involve the gnomes wearing small festive hats and not being entirely happy about it. Harry sat in the living room on the squashy sofa that had been repaired so many times that it was now mostly repair and sat softer because of it, and he looked at the tree in the corner, real, slightly crooked, decorated with handmade ornaments and enchanted tinsel that shifted color slowly, and he felt the burrow around him the way he felt Hogwarts, the warm magical signature of it, the specific quality of a house that had been loved in and fought in and lived in by the same family for generations. Sirius was coming for Christmas Day. He'd written to say he was well enough to travel, that the healer had cleared it, that he was going to be there at 10 and was going to bring something that Molly would find excessive and that he didn't care, and Harry had written back to say that sounded perfect and meant it. Hermione was at home with her parents, but she'd sent a package that arrived that morning via owl, 3 books, which was Hermione's native language for I thought about you specifically when I found these, and a letter that was 2 pages of her thoughts on everything that had happened over the last 2 months, written in the flowing, dense, honest way she wrote when she wasn't editing for audience. He'd read it twice already. Ron came and dropped onto the sofa beside him with 2 cups of something hot and handed one over and said nothing, which was one of Ron's greatest skills. Harry held the cup and looked at the tree. "You all right?" Ron said, after a while. "Yes," Harry said. And then, because it was true and it deserved to be said plainly, "I'm actually all right." Ron nodded. "Good," he said. "You were owed it." Outside, the snow was still falling in the dark, deep and unhurried, covering the garden and the field beyond it and the gnomes with their festive hats and the old apple tree that leaned at the edge of the property, and the burrow was warm and loud above them both. And somewhere north of London in Azkaban the empty cell that had held a man for 10 years was being repurposed for someone else, and somewhere not north of London at all that man was sleeping without dementors for the first time in a decade and beginning the long, real work of coming back to himself. And underneath the Ministry of Magic on level 10, a courtroom chair sat empty with its chains coiled at its arms, and in a ministry holding facility an old man who had saved the world several times and had also stolen something irreplaceable from a boy who had never been given a choice about any of it was sitting with his own thoughts and his own reckoning, and what he made of that reckoning was going to be his own work in the time that remained to him. Harry finished his tea. The tree lights shifted from gold to silver to a warm, deep blue that reminded him of the sky over Hogwarts at dusk, when the light went horizontal and the lake went flat and the towers looked like they'd been there since before the idea of time. He thought, "I have a godfather who grins with his whole body and is going to be here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." He thought, "I have 2 friends who are the best people I know and who chose me before they knew what I was." He thought, "I am 11 years old and I am the most powerful wizard anyone in this country has measured in living memory, and I have not yet begun to understand what I can do with that." He thought, "I am going to find out. Not urgently. Not with the desperate, driven quality of someone who has something to prove. Just, in the natural course of things, in the ordinary daily expansion of a life that was finally, genuinely, completely his own. He was going to find out the way you find out what you love by doing things and paying attention. He was going to find out the way his parents had found out, in the middle of everything, in the chaotic, unplannable, irreducibly real texture of being alive. He was going to find out, and he was going to do it without anyone turning the volume down. Ron's mother called something from the kitchen about dinner in 20 minutes, and Ron called back that he'd heard, and from upstairs came the sound of the twins doing something that registered a full 3 seconds before the smell did, and Ginny shot past the living room door at a run, and Arthur's voice from somewhere said something about regulations and Ron said something about relax, Dad. And the house was loud and warm and full, and Harry sat in the middle of it with the magic in him, running at full tide, and felt, for the first time in his life, the specific and irreducible sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, everything that had been taken was being, piece by piece, given back. And Harry Potter, 11 years old, unchained, undiminished, and entirely himself, let it come.